pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. All right, I'll do roll call. Megan Doyle.
Here.
Scott Fermender.
Present.
Tracy Irby.
Here.
Tom Kopa.
Here.
Lauren Mahler.
Here.
Christina Preet.
Here.
Adam Scobie.
Here.
Mike Smith.
Present.
Cindy Wilpointon.
Here.
And I'm here too, Susan Glennon. So all board members present, and the record will show that Mr. Smith is remote. All right, first agenda item. Dr. Otire or Mr. Brennan? Tools for schools notification.
I have lots of handouts here, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Just having difficulty juggling all that. So we'll turn things right over to Mr. Brennan and Mr. Bradbury for a newly legislative requirement that will need to occur annually for us. So over to Mr. Brennan and Mr. Bradbury.
Thank you very much. What has happened is the state has another mandate that we have to do tools for schools and get it implemented into the classrooms this year. So tonight is really, I just have to make the checklist that we did in December available for public viewing. It just checks one more piece off the tools for schools, so we're all set. We've completed all the checklists, and we are currently running tools for schools through the buildings. We're meeting with their occupational and safety meetings. So they each have a committee at the school that will help us with inspections and any indoor air quality issues that come up. We've actually, tools for schools, it was in the past, they had it, then they stopped the funding for it. The person that was running it, Kenny Foskey, retired, and they never filled the position, and it dropped off. And then this year, they picked it back up. They mandated that we do it. They haven't given us really any guidelines on training and whatnot, but we're picking up with the program we've had, so we're doing pretty well with it. It really is a school-based program. It gets all the occupants in the school involved in their indoor air quality. And it helps us, let them be part of the solution. A couple of things that we try and get rid of are air fresheners. You never know what will trigger an asthmatic to do that. So that's kind of what the thing is. Carpets, we want to get rid of as many carpets as I can. Plants. So we're doing this all the time. We have our operations heroes. We're on top of these checklists. We were able to do a lot of it right from our preventative maintenance program, so it's helpful. This just documents what we have done. The reports are here to meet the mandate, and we're good for this year. So that was really it. If there's any questions.
That was easy.
It was very easy.
And this has to be put up on the website?
It's
Correct.
all, I already have them on all the websites. I have them at all the school websites, and it's on our Board of Education website also. So you can see all the checklists that are in this book right there. And we'll present once a year on any issues we have. We have a new checklist going out tomorrow. We're test riding it at Mathewson, that the teacher can do a quick checklist of their own room. It's 20 questions. They can do it on their phone, their iPad, or anything, and it all comes back to us, and we'll see if there's any problems we have to take a look at there.
So this will become like an annual report
It's an annual report.
at this time of year?
Yes. We're going to be doing it all year, but I have to have everything in at the end of the year for the state, and I upload it all to the state
Okay.
website.
All right.
All right?
Any questions for Mr. Bradbury? Ms. Mahler?
Since this was the first version of these, what did you find?
Well, what was great about it was that we got out to the two guys that did most of the checklist, produced another list for me of other items. Not really that were indoor air quality issues, but maybe a piece of baseboard's off, I have to change the ceiling tiles. So they brought me back another massive list that I get to work off of. So we're doing a lot of this work. We're doing the filter changes, we're changing the belts, we're doing all this all during the year. So we're really on top of all of our equipment. And so the equipment piece I wasn't concerned about, but the good piece is that we're educating the staff and hopefully some students on how the building operates. How does the heat come out of the radiator? How does the air get changed in the building? So they're starting to learn a little bit about that, which is nice. So,
Were there any issues that popped up going through those checklists? Like you said, making it sound like we're totally on top of it, there was nothing new, there was nothing we weren't expecting, we knew everything that was coming out of this.
Mhm.
Was there anything that you had to fix that was air quality related, not baseboard related,
well,
that
there were
popped up?
we found a couple fans that were turning over too much air.
Okay.
So we have to slow those down a little bit. We found maybe a couple of dampers in the unit ventilators that weren't going to their proper position. They might have been under or over, but they're still moving air. We're just dialing in at this point, so, which was good. It was good to find. We didn't find any major issues. We didn't find anything that, when this piece of equipment show up, nothing like that. So it's been good.
Okay.
All positive.
Ms. Doyle?
Thank you. Just clarifying, this is different from the consultant-based air quality.
The TAB report is different. That's due in '26, and that's an old set of engineers that come through and do the testing and balancing of each classroom.
Okay, all right, great, thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Bradbury?
Thank you very
All
much.
right, thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Bradbury.
Thanks, Pat. Right, yeah. Thank you.
So now we'll shift to a long-range facilities planning workshop with Dr. Broderick and Dr. Reynolds, and we have a presenter tonight, Mr. David Stein from Silver Petroselli and Associates. Thank you.
I can only literally out of one eye.
I don't think it's an actual, it's a volumes.
Right. On the website, there should be something we actually get.
With something for every single school.
Yes, right, and we've done that kind of presentation before, so I'll send it in.
Good evening.
I'm sorry, you
So-
read.
No, it's fine. I was just, could do a quick introduction here. Ms. Glenn and members of the board. So throughout the course of this long-range study, some additional questions have arose at different points where we've said, we really need to think about how do we dial in on some expertise to help us move forward with some of our thinking. So as a result of one of our recent board meetings, we took those questions and we tried to hone those in on what information in this short amount of time can be thought about to help us take a step back to take a step forward. And David Stein is a principal over at Silver Petroselli, and we worked with David here to help try to grasp the concept of the questions that were coming to us from that, and asked Mr. Stein if he was able to take some of this information and try to think about how does the answers to some of these questions help move us forward in this process. So Mr. Stein was able to put together some presentation for us to help us think about some potential answers to those questions and some possible next steps. So we thank you for your quick work on this. We know it was a tall task to get this together in such a short amount of time, but we really do appreciate you working on this information, and we look forward to the presentation this evening.
Great, well, thank you, and good evening, everybody. Again, my name is David Stein. I'm Vice President and Principal with Silver Petroselli and Associates. I think some of you know our work. It dates back to over 30, almost 4 years since we started our firm. I've been with the firm since 1993, and even some background. I grew up in Milford, so I bring that experience of going to Mathewson and going to Jonathan Law, and even lamenting I would have went to Milford High, but my class was shifted over to Jonathan Law. So, you know, in that time of me working professionally as an architect and the work that we've done across the district, I've had the opportunity of pretty much touching each and every one of your schools in some, on a personal level or a professional level. So with that, and myself with my 30-plus years of experience, our work, which is rooted in the K through 12 throughout Connecticut, we help districts just like yours, and the majority of them, we've probably touched almost 169 of those towns in some capacity. But over those 33 years, we've done long-range studies just like these, in a way to help districts like you look at their infrastructure and make some long-range restructuring plans. I moved out of Milford, I moved into Wallingford, and we were hired back in 2017 in Wallingford to do an exact same study of looking at their 11 schools, studying all the infrastructure of their buildings, which are dated somewhat in the same era as yours, and also looking at the question of consolidating their two high schools to one. We put a proof of concept together for them that looked at how you can fit, at least in that case, a consolidated high school of about the same size, 1,600 students in their case, onto one of their existing, their Lyman Hall High School. We looked at their middle schools, we looked at their elementary schools, and there's also now in the process of trying to figure out exactly what the community wants to do. So I think drawing on that experience of that, we're currently in Monroe, been working with them for the last year. They're also tackling, in their case, an enrollment increase, so they're trying to figure out what their best long-range plans are. So the presentation that I have for you tonight brings that experience to how do you now take all these ideas and start moving them in a systematic way forward, but also to round yourself back with the proof of concepts that may be discussed. So with that, actually back in 2013-14, our group actually worked for Milford Public School and the Board of Education and made similar presentations. And these are just sort of two of the exhibits that we looked at back at that time, studying the utilization of your buildings, studying the long-range planning, even floated the single consolidated high school concept. So went back to that information that we created a decade ago and looked through that and just tried to now compare it to where you sit now with some of your recent enrollment projections. So I'm drawing on the data that you had done recently over the past year or two in terms of those projections to kind of give you a format. So I want to start just kind of going through the high school and then work our way through in the middle school one step at a time. But as you're doing any type of an evaluation of your real estate or your existing infrastructure, you want to start looking at the site itself. And the state of Connecticut has, and it was developed in 2016, has remained pretty much intact, their school construction standards and guidelines. That's kind of our Bible of what we use to establish at least a baseline of what all districts should be using for building their schools throughout the state of Connecticut. And there's a portion related to the site here, and it starts with the high school, breaks it up for middle school and for elementary. But starting at the high school, and I am working with 1,500 students, which is pretty much the number that was shown on the long-range projection done by SLAM Collaborative, projecting all the way out to 30, 33, 34, so that's the number that I'm using. And they have a math formula, it's fairly simple. It basically says for 1,500 students, there's a category depending on whether it's less or not, that you should at least have 1 acre per 100 students, and at least starting at 15 acres. So based on the math, you need a site of roughly 35 acres. Well, that doesn't check off all the boxes. There's a lot more that I'll talk to you about by doing that. Do the same formula with the middle school. That's just consolidated. It would be smaller, obviously, if you broke up between two schools or roughly 600 students, and then the same for elementary. So it gives you at least a framework of comparing, and you'll see in the slides coming up what you currently have with your real estate of your other properties. Where does that sit in what would be the ideal site or configuration? So you need to, again, you need to start with the site, in our opinion. Look at that, look at its placement. So as part of that site consideration, some of the main bullet points that you have to start looking at is its property size. And what I mean by size is not just the acreage, but its geometry, its meets and bounds. It is a square site, a triangular site, an oblong site. That all is important to sort of evaluate of what you either currently have or if you're projecting a neutral site. The topography is critical. It needs to be relatively flat, although you can build on hilly sites, but you're looking for sites that are ideal. The environmental impact is very important. Milford being on the coastline, this exhibit that I have here comes from your recent plan of conservation and development, so that's just a screenshot that I took from there that highlighted and started looking at different impacts around the town related to just some of your waterways, your coastal ways, and so forth. So it begins to limit where you would want to build and some of the limitations related to that. Your utilities and the impact that you may have on water or sewer. Do you have the infrastructure in place to be able to handle these expansions, renovations, or build as new? Communications such as fiber optics, cell phone, other communication utilities, they may be in certain areas of town, but not necessarily everywhere. And there's an impact or a cost that goes along with extending it to those particular sites. Fire hydrants is important. You may have water in the street, but you may not have enough pressure to do so. So you either need fire pumps or holding tanks, and you got to put that into your evaluation. The traffic impact for any school, the right way of doing it is to have multiple entry points from a public safety perspective. In most neighborhood schools, there's an entry in, and there's fences around the back where ball fields are. If you're looking for an ideal site, you want multiple entries in there, not only for parents and busing and students and staff, but for emergency service vehicles. So in that evaluation of any of these sites, these are big items that need to be evaluated as you're starting this consideration of where would this be, and is this the right site for us to do any type of expansion or renovation. The same check marks go for your middle and elementary schools, especially if you're considering building on those sites, is how actually would you implement some of that. There's still those same constraints that I talked about before with a high school, smaller, obviously, in size, the athletic fields, the other amenities, but still the same type of impact. Traffic queuing for internal busing changes differently than it would for high school, middle school, or elementary, and depending where that sits within the neighborhoods, its pedestrian connection, its walkability, its bikeability, all of those come into play as we evaluate and determine which are the right sites. So once we step away from the site itself and start asking the question, at least on the high school, is what is the right size? Even if we're just looking at a footprint, we know we have classrooms, we have gymnasiums, we have large spaces, cafeterias, and so forth, but what is the right size? Well, the state of Connecticut has a space standard calculation. This is mainly based on reimbursement. So as far as the share that the state would provide to you, they limit the size of the school, and that's based on the population. You're allowed to build larger, you can, but those items are deemed ineligible. There are a list of other items that are deemed ineligible, off-site improvements, as I mentioned, traffic signals, utilities, all that stuff over the property line is not eligible. But as we look at what would be the right size, at least on a high level, without drawing any lines on a piece of paper, without putting anything together, we can look at this calculation and determine for the high school at roughly 1,500 students. Again, I'm using that projection from the 33, 34 year, 1,500 students, times about an average of 175 square foot per student. And this is net square footage, so without getting too technical, it's basically, I'm just saying the the square footage, the inside walls of a room. This isn't the gross square footage of the building, and that's how the state looks at that for reimbursement. So in reality, a 262,000 net square footage building is the inside. It'd probably be 290 square feet, 300,000 square feet when we look at all the structure in the outside walls. So from there, that gives you the size of building that then you would have to figure out how to put on a footprint of an existing site. So with that, we then look at your middle school and the expansion to potentially 2 and how that math all worked itself out, okay? So just looking at what you currently have, okay, between the 3 schools, you know, you're roughly 200 square foot at East Shore. West Shore, you're roughly 193, and at Harborside, you're 189 square foot. Now, adding those all together, looking at the total square footage for all those students. Now, if we then looked at the space standards for just 600 students per school, right? We are at an average of about 170 square foot. It says that both of those schools, two middle schools, should roughly be about 170,000 square feet. So about a 20,000 square foot difference between each one of those in some capacity. So now you're starting to see the difference in scale between a high school, the scale of a middle school. I then wanted to now show you and give you a comparison of what we have on the screen between the two, between East Shore and with West Shore. West Shore obviously being on the left, East Shore being on the right of the image. As I mentioned, it's 78,000, roughly 78,000 square feet for West Shore and just under 10 acres. So in comparison to what I showed you before in terms of the guidelines, it's showing you you're less, you're in a consolidated piece. But now we start looking at where would you potentially expand? Because if you're going to consolidate and roughly add 200 students to each one of those schools, we would then need to find where do we expand and add that somewhere between 15 and 20,000 square feet worth of additions. So what I'm showing is just a very brief diagram in yellow of where you naturally look at classroom expansions. You already have your main infrastructure in place in these buildings, your mechanical rooms, your gymnasiums, your media centers. These all have been recently added onto and renovated, right? We were actually a part of both of those recent renovations. But the sites are tight, right? You're beginning to see now adding X amount of students to both of these sites, parking, bus queuing, parent drop-off, increased staffing, and then enough room for play fields all come into play when you're looking at this as a potential another expansion to the existing building. You do have the ability to go up or vertical when you're on a tight site, so those are all possibilities to do. They would just require elevators and stairs, but it's something that needs to be considered. Site safety is important, right, to sort of look at that and the separation of where those students are and how you could create a good circulation piece throughout. We do have to look at utilities. We need to look at wetlands over at East Shore. That bottom right where you see the green area actually falls under sort of a wetland piece, so that would need to be designed and considered. So then we look at the elementary schools, so you do that in the same way. Any of these site studies, you have to check off those same boxes. But I wanted to get more to a granular level of the programming that goes into the space. And the diagram that we have up here is really taking this as a pie-shaped area of where do you divvy up the proportions between the right number of core learning spaces, to facility support, to school support, to all the other pieces and parts or spaces that go into a program. And from there, you want to see a certain utilization rate. We want to hit a target and say you're being as efficient as about 80 or 85% of your existing building. You also want to have room for, some room for expansion within any of your designs that you're doing. Now, the state limits you. That's why I said they give you a formula. They don't want you to over-design. They want you to use the enrollment projections to hit the right number. But there needs to be a sensible tolerance between how big this building should be so you can expand. Or you look at your site and say, well, this is where the natural expansion would be if we were forecasting sort of forward. So not only is this decision or these discussions about now, it should also be thinking about what it could potentially be. So that's where then the programming and utilization, our methodology, is breaking that up. And it comes back to sort of the targeted, and what I have up here are just examples. These don't necessarily reflect your numbers, but they're fairly close to what you have in terms of targeted classroom sizes. And those align with many other industry standards for overall student-to-teacher ratios of classroom sizes. And with that, you want to hit that sort of utilization rate that we are showing there. So each space is broken down. You look at the square footage and determine that overall size of the building. So with that, the question always, as we have earlier, as you're looking at, I'm sure people are thinking 260,000 square feet. What does that cost? What are the cost implications of doing this? What are other districts doing in terms of their expansion plans? So what I have here is some examples from the recent, what's called the priority list, the funding from the state bond list that was approved and projects that are in motion. I have two here from Stanford that were from 2024. So that means these were developed in 2023 and they're starting construction now. They're needing to project out forward before they even have a shovel in the ground, and these two do not have a shovel in the ground at the moment. I want to show you how districts have to forecast. The two that I'm showing you, these are an upper and lower school, but they're essentially a K through 4 and a 5 through 8. So roughly the same age group as what you have within your district. You can see the cost range of these, and we have seen some have come back and asked for more money just because of the volatility of the market over the past few years. It's really been difficult to pinpoint these large projects, and you're limited on adding too much contingency in there. So you really got to hit the bullseye, which is a challenge for, I think, any architect or construction manager currently. But these are two projects that are sort of very similar in nature. They align in terms of square footage. So when you look at the square footages that we're showing you, roughly 78. This is a brand new, so these are brand new buildings. Brand new buildings at roughly 78,000 square feet. Now their population is less than 600, but you're starting to see how design of at least the new building or extensions and alterations, the size of that gives you the scale compared to what you currently have. Also to the right is the brand new, it just opened this fall, so ground up, brand new Farmington High School. A little smaller, but roughly the same, of just call it 1,400 students, 271,000 square feet, and $132 million. That was built on their existing site. They essentially flipped their fields and was able to keep the existing high school open. They built the new one in areas and then sort of demolished that, and then they are actually leaving their original high school, which was built in, original portion of high school that was built in 1928. That's being converted to town halls. I'm showing that because we're part of that project. So we're very familiar with this. So this is the most recent high school built in the state of Connecticut that aligns with at least the capacity of what you're looking for, and one that was either built, built on a site that was contiguous with the existing high school. So with all that data that I shared with you, I'd like to now talk about, well, how do you take that and start planning ahead? What's the best path forward in thinking about this large restructuring plan? So with that, I think the first step, okay, is really to evaluate again your sites. Okay, so whether you're looking at the high school, whether you're starting with that first, or you're starting with the middle school or the elementary schools, you gotta start with the site. And then from there, you need to build educational specifications that really hone in on that best utilization rate. Now, one thing and I'll go back to the slide because I think I forgot to make the point on when I looked at the square footage of the existing building. This does not take into account a pool, or an auditorium, or a planetarium. So the space calculations do not consider those other amenities. They also the calculations are also based on size of auditoriums and other ancillary spaces, secondary gymnasium spaces, black box theaters, CTE programs. So some of those change your overall program. So your educational specs, before you draw any lines on paper, are going to be key. As you're looking at sites, you also need to look at your educational specs and prepare what the vision of any of those primary program spaces want to be. From there, you really need a design and a construction management team to help make those technical evaluations and also provide you with what those costs will be, because they're so hard to predict. You're starting early without anything, and you really need a good advisor to help you with that. And some of those vary. I kind of noted this all sort of varies. Like it really depends on your vision, and it should get structured accordingly. The next piece then goes to the filing for an application and your state grant funding. So you need your educational specs, you need to have some sense of what the cost is going to be, and that's what you put in for your application. That process takes over 12 months. By the time you put your application in June or June 30th, you don't hear until really July officially that you have that. And that's the normal progression. Then you start designing, then you start preparing the documents and really getting into the nuts and bolts of the design, and that could easily take a year and a half. It's 12 to 18 months worth of development. That depends and varies on the project that you're trying to do. And then just noting construction, depending on the site, depending on some of those conditions, they can vary. A brand new high school, for example, Farmington easily took close to 24 to 36 months from start to finish to close out. So these are, as you see, just starting alone, you're already a few years out before you would even be able to conceive that. So you're projecting well over 7 years out on some of those numbers, and that's the reason why you need that enrollment projections to be able to forecast that time where you think you will be moving forward. So I know I've spoken a lot, and this is my last slide, obviously, to open it up for questions and answers, is from here, it's really starting to establish what are your concepts. Are you concentrating on the high school concept? Are you looking at the consolidation of the middle schools? Are you looking at the number of elementary schools? That is a first step to then take you to the next level, which is truly the site selection piece. From there, as I mentioned, the educational piece. But I think what that does, and I have this, and Mr. Brennan and I were talking earlier, I put the circular loop here purposely because you need to then do a proof of concept to say, I've gone through all of these steps, and does this now make sense to what we thought before? Because that you may pivot through some of those because the site ruled some considerations out, your educational specs changed, the cost. Now, as part of the site selection, the question is, how much due diligence do I do? How much money do we actually spend to explore and check off whether or not this site is the perfect one? So some things you'll want to do, aside from just studying the mapping and meeting with your land use professionals and your public safety professionals, you may need to invest in some borings to see if there's ledge, if there's rock, if there's a high water table. You need to look at your wetland mapping and have a soil scientist come in and sort of explore the impact, because that, you don't want to get too far down the line and then those get discovered later, okay? There are costs that you want to try to capture as best you can, and often they get put off because there's an upfront investment cost in doing that. You want to do traffic studies and utility studies and so forth. So you could take those all one step at a time. Okay, these all don't have to be done sort of all in once, but our advice is take this sort of in a systematic way, and then you need to round yourself back up to sort of validate that overall proof of concept. Site selection, depending on how much and how many sites you're looking at, or assume these are all public sites, which ones do you identify and how many do you study? Or do you focus in on one and then just do sort of a progression to that? That could take 9 months worth of time to, have a design team open it up and explore. The educational specs are not that time driven. They just need the right people around the table to work on them, and those could come together in 3 or 4 months in a reasonable way. But just looking at those two, where you're a year before you're rounding back to make those long-range decisions. So with all of that, I'll turn it back over to you for questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stein. Questions? Ms. Doyle?
Thank you. I have a number of questions, but the first question, just off the bat, and Mr. Brennan will help with this question as well, is my understanding, we had confronted this before with the facility, permanent schools facility, is Milford has previously received bonding first and then sought reimbursement, so it changes our status of those. How is that in a much larger project? Because you can correct me, but from what I've seen, the bonding that we've utilized through the capital improvement plan is anywhere from roofing to millions of dollars to do an expansion at Law and Foreign, and I don't know what the capital budget of how does Milford prior practice situate in this process?
Yeah, so we fully fund our projects up front, and then we proceed at risk with that and apply through the state and get reimbursement post project completion.
So it'd be a similar process, okay?
So similarly, we would go to a capital improvement plan. We would suggest that this is what we would like to do. We would like to get bonding, and then we would go through and get based on reimbursement from the state and how we proceed with all our other projects. So how does that affect timeline in any way?
I think very similar to that timeline. So it's we would once we go through our normal process. So once we had that plan outlined, we would go through our normal capital improvement plan process, where we would bring before you our recommendations that are discussed at the board meetings, and then once those are approved, we would go through the different layers of approval process with the capital improvement plan, which would then go to the mayor on the mayor's forms. He would bring that before the bond council, and then the board of finance, and then the board of aldermen would ultimately approve that. Once we have that bonding secured, then we would, at that point, secure an architect to help design the project. And then as we go through that process, we would then create ed specifications for it. We would also create plan specs and estimates with input throughout the process from various stakeholders as we design this, which is also approved through the Permanent Schools Facilities Building Committee. It's always a tricky one. Permanent Schools Facilities Building Committee. And then at that point, once we have those pieces complete, then we are eligible to apply to the state. So you need all those different components in order to apply to the state. Otherwise, they will not accept an incomplete application. But that's the process for that. And then at that stage, you would then now go out as an RFP to select a contractor to help build these various improvements, whatever they may be. Once that contractor is selected, then they would go through the process of actually completing the construction.
Right. Okay, so it's very similar planning, it's just a matter of how we go through the process, it's just a different chunking of information, and we have the money, we know what our budget is, and this is basically, we better proceed with that knowledge in mind.
I think the way that we do it here in Milford, I think is actually a benefit to speeding up that process.
Right.
But I think no matter what, it's still a very lengthy process.
Right.
Because there's a number of steps that need to happen. For instance, when we get something approved through the Board of Ed, like if we were to approve like ed specifications, then we would have to wait, let's say that was our last piece, we'd have to wait till that next board meeting to approve the minutes of that board meeting, so that we can then use those as documentation that these were actually approved by the state. So there's various components of the process that have like, can't do this until this is done.
Right.
And that, each one of those creates a unavoidable extension of timeline.
So let's just, can we just do like a expectation setting a little bit? Is so we do the capital improvement plan, we make a suggestion. I'm not saying anything of what that suggestion is. And that's the next time we do it, and then it's next approved. So at the earliest, the funding for any project that we're going to do would be coming at what period of time?
That following year.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think the timeline of that project would really kind of depend, and Mr. Stein, please jump in, depending upon the scope of it. So if you were going to knock down and build new,
Right.
that automatically would create a longer timeline than just a possible addition, would be my understanding of it.
Right.
Correct.
So my whole purpose of this is just like, nothing is happening tomorrow.
No.
Like, every decision is going to take years before we make any final decisions, and like, it's not an overnight decision that if we retire a building, it happens tomorrow. It's like, there are processes that occur before we get to that day one, shovel in the ground. So.
And that's why I liked Mr. Stein's slide, I think it was slide 14, whatever that last slide was there, where he shows that arrow looping back to it, because there is like different pieces of this that do feel kind of cyclical, where you're going through and you're talking about, okay, does this work? And then you do a little more research, and then you think, okay, well, is this still, in line with what we were thinking?
Okay, thank you. I'll let it go.
Other questions? Mr. Koba?
I'm looking at the Stanford project and the Farmington
Yeah.
School project. Looks like the Stanford was like $1,000 a square foot, and the Farmington was like $500 a square foot. It's
$1,000 is really, and that's what I was really getting at, is those, those numbers that you see there. This was completed in 2024.
Yeah, so
That was probably
this is
on the
now
priority
starting.
list 4 years earlier.
Okay.
Yes.
So yes, we used to have a threshold. In 2018, 19, I would say our numbers we were projecting was somewhere around $650 a square foot. Where now our buildings are all coming in right around $1,000 a square foot, so.
So this would be, today would be closer to $270 million. Because we've been tossing around 300 million, and so when I saw 132 million, I'm thinking.
So here's the only challenge with looking at them as full comparisons. Sites are very different, one site compared to the other. 30% of your cost could be on the site piece of it. Sometimes some of these numbers that you see up here also could consider some site acquisition costs that are built into those. So, I don't have the detailed breakdown, they don't share the detailed breakdown of each one of those. But I would say right now, if you ask what is the square footage, aside from major site improvements of a brand new school, it's roughly 1,000 square foot.
Okay.
$1,000 per square foot.
Is that it, Mr. Koba?
Yep, that's it, thank you.
Ms. Wolf Boynton?
So thank you for this, and I was really appreciative of the graphics that showed the two middle schools. Can you talk a little bit about the space that the spaces our schools reside on? Because earlier in the presentation, when you were talking about the number of acres per number of students, you know, was trying to wrap my head around it, envisioning foreign-in-law as maybe meeting those, but, you know, not so sure about our grammar schools.
Well, I think they all fall under the number that is just shown as, and you know, use the data. The data has to try to provide an average number. So I try not, although I'm showing it, I don't want to be fixated by the number, because I think good design could solve it even in a tighter space. But just on average, so foreign is at 26, is roughly 26 acres, and law is 31 acres. So I think you're well within the reasonable number at the two high schools of where you are.
Okay.
All right. When we look, and I mentioned obviously the two middle schools, East Shore and West Shore. The remainder of the elementary schools, let's see, so Cap Penn actually I think is the largest at 12.5, JFK at 11.5, Live Oaks at 12.5. Actually Mathewson is the largest at 13.75. Meadowside is at 10.3, Orange Ave at 10. I think these are all actually all within average. The extra acre or two that you see could just be based on the geometry of where they sit in the neighborhoods they were built in. So they were roughly placed, you know, when they were originally built on essentially the same size lots. So that's pretty interesting, and they all have, you know, they all have adjacent fields. The configurations, they were all essentially built with the same template and footprint, right? So, but if you were building a brand new one, you look at some of those other constraints. Entry, right, most of them only have primary one entry into the lot. Where you really wanted the better practice is to have two entry points. Well, you work with what you have, right? And if you can't navigate a second entryway, you figure out some other configuration to sort of enhance the open perimeter around that building. So all in all, other than I guess Orchard Hills is the only one that is on 5.64 acres. So when you look at that and you start doing a deeper dive into the site studies, you start seeing the limitations of being able to, where would you build, how would you phase that in there? The site's going to answer those questions for you, because there's only so much constraint that you can work with.
Does that acreage, would that acreage include any wetlands that might be on the property?
The acreage all would include the wetlands, so then we need to subtract any of those boundaries, buffers, building setbacks, or even just good practice setbacks from neighbors, sight lines of the building, positioning, so all of that comes into play.
I know that Jonathan Law has some wetlands.
And Jonathan Law definitely has some wetlands, yes.
Do you have you were giving acreage, just rattling off there, what was the Harborside acreage currently?
It's
So I don't
9.8.
have
Yeah,
to dig it out of this pile.
9.83.
It's 9.8.
And what were the other two?
Yeah, they're on the slide with the pictures.
East Shore is 10.5 and West Shore is 10.75.
Harborside was 9.1.
9.83.
Can you clarify that for Harborside, does that include the fields?
Which are city property, right?
There are no fields.
No. The Wasson Field?
Yeah.
I don't believe so.
No, I don't believe so. No.
That seems like
It
seems like a lot of acreage for that spot, considering.
that's what
I
I'm trying
think
to figure out.
parking and
Parking in the
other,
back.
A parking lot in the back that sits right
And it
next to
does have a
the.
big
And
front
it does have a
yard.
big front, yeah, all the way to the front, even though
Those
it's not
parking lots are
really
really good.
usable
Yeah.
per se as a
But-
field. There is that grass area that goes up to, I don't know what that road is over there.
High
Um,
Street, High Street.
High Street, Darren?
Yeah.
Dorina Place.
Dorina, yeah,
Yeah.
that side, and then there's that front parking lot and then the loop, so
And so all the way into the back, it goes
Yeah.
right into the courthouse.
But the
And then-
parking lot, though, is only the first rows, right? It's not, I mean, it's that first area that has, you know,
Yeah,
there's
the property
parking
is an
on-
imaginary boundary line.
Right, because the bulk of that parking is the courthouse parking, not
Oh, in the
On the
back,
other
yes.
side.
On the other
on the
side,
back, on the
yes.
back.
Yeah.
On the side, there's, yeah,
Yeah, on the other
Yep.
side.
Yep, and in the front, we were talking about that loop.
the
in
loop,
front.
and then
Yeah.
there's on
And
the
then
right.
there's also
on the
parking
left,
on the
we're looking
side.
at- Yeah. A lot of
Basketball court.
wasted space, maybe you could.
Yes.
So, other questions? I had some. So, in terms of the, again, with the, just looking at the Farmington High School piece, how, so that square footage would be, is it just like the main building? I mean, how do you then, I guess what you're saying is that you have to then consider your, whatever other things you want in your, you know.
That's where the programming and the ed specs now narrate and describe exactly what meets your educational vision.
So something like turf fields and that's all ancillary then?
It's not ancillary in the acre component because it looks at a high school and traditionally those are housed on the same property.
Okay.
Okay, not every district has their fields, you know, located on the same property, but that's part of that calculation. In terms of the educational programming, yes, you're looking at everything from administration to classrooms, to media center, to theater. Question then, are you doing an natatorium? Are you doing a planetarium? Are you doing a STEM or a STEAM program?
You mentioned
Are
the
you-
CTE.
Which, or could be, or an enhanced CTE program, right? All of those come into the equation to determine what's the right square footage. Now, the square footage I showed you based on the space standards, again, is purely based on reimbursement. The state says, I'll only pay you for X, and then we'll net out other items that are non-reimbursable.
So that's an important part.
That's an important part when you're looking at from a fiscal perspective, is how much share is coming from the city of Milford and how much share would be coming from the state of Connecticut through state of Connecticut bonding.
And are the things that you just mentioned, are those reimbursable to any degree?
Up to the space standards that are there.
Okay. Any other questions?
So just, I'm sorry, just to clarify, so this black box theater, for example, we would pay for that ourselves,
Well,
right? Like
poten-
anything that's above the space stand, any extras, the natatorium.
If we go above the 170, we
If
Yeah.
you go above that number, really the answer is if you go above that number. So this
Even
is
if
where
it's
the
there.
creative
Right.
piece of, you know, your architect comes into play, where they could create a classroom space that serves multiple purposes and maybe uses black box theater, it could be used as a traditional classroom. You try to be creative with using that space in a
Sure.
way to not over-design a building. So this is clearly a 50-year building, right? Your buildings are well over 50 years. So you're trying to project out something that's going to live 50 years. So you don't want to design spaces that are honed in specifically just on one space. You really want to make sure you have enough flexibility to adapt that program over the years. So your space standards, which is a written document, it's not drawing any lines, it doesn't show any form of architecture. That is a very important document because it narrates, it purely describes exactly what your vision is educationally. From there, your architect then figures out how to put that on paper and create a design.
So specifically in terms of trying to estimate a cost of making an addition, adding on space to increase capacity for students, if we were to go that route
Right.
at West Shore and East Shore, is that in that, how would
Yes.
we, is that in here?
Yeah, so when I looked at both of your buildings are roughly just under 80,000
Mhm.
square feet, right?
Yes.
Then I looked at the space standards, and that's for a student population of roughly, 400 and change, right? We now look at, and you have 1,200 students, a little over 1,200 students. If I just simply divide that in half and say 600 and 600, and we run the space calculations, it says it could be a building of 100,000 square feet. What's interesting is the slide that I have up in front for the 5 through 8 grades, that square footage is about 80,000 square feet for 590 students. So that's why I want to just point that out, is it depends on how efficient your architect could design and stay under the space standards, but also meet the capacity and needs of the ed specs. So although I'm showing you these numbers, you don't have to, you could be creative and design under them and also be efficient with that. With that being said, in this case, it's $1,000 a square foot. So gives you at least a sense of scale and student enrollment projection, grade level, and cost. So that's why I showed this as a good comparison.
Can I follow up on that, Sue, specifically?
Yep, yeah.
The projections at the middle school level are roughly 1,200. So roughly 444 or 66. But we have talked about not building to 100% capacity. We talked about building to, I believe it's 80% capacity? 85% capacity. Math that very quickly for me. That has us building to a capacity that is more than 600 if we go to that too. So it's not as simple as there's 400 there now, we're going to divide the other ones, we just need to build for 200 more. We don't. We need to build for a significant number more than just that 200. So it's not something as simple as this many square feet and this price. It's actually higher than this based on the 85% building capacity target.
Okay, and your two sites will also provide you with what those possibilities are, but also
Right.
what your constraints may be. And that may back you, and that's why I showed this as a circular piece. You're going to go through each step of this due diligence, and you're going to need to round yourself back off to see, does that 80%
Right.
work for us or not? And with any design, there's some compromise that goes along with it. That's where you begin to sort of weigh that out and see what compromises you're willing to make.
So given what we see based on the site constraints as we get farther down the road, we may very well find ourselves in a place where it doesn't actually make sense to do that, and we end up revisiting that piece of the plan overall and saying that it actually, based on the site constraints that we have, made sense to stay with 3 in the first place.
It's all possible.
Just
and that's
Depending
why
on the
we-
site constraints of the third building though, too. I mean, there's a lot.
Depending on the
yeah.
site constraints of the 2 existing buildings, if we were to follow your idea just there and say we're going to do the 2 schools and expand them to increase the capacity to account for the existing student population theoretically being split, so we got extra two, plus the extra 15% capacity that we need to build into that square footage. It may be that the physical site locations in both of those places aren't capable of handling that. So we either have to relent on that 85% capacity, or we have to go back to the drawing board because that's not possible.
You mentioned,
Feels like an awful lot of effort to end up right where we started.
well, but I think,
That may happen anyway, with all of
Yeah, with any of it, absolutely. Yeah,
Um,
that's just a big one.
in terms of building up, you mentioned vertical building. I know that was something that was tossed around with the West Shore building 10 years ago.
Mhm.
What type of studies would that require to see if is there any,
I think it's just, it's running plans and seeing what's the most efficient way and how best that's circulated, how you will operate a 2-story.
well, West Shore
addition.
already has 2 stories.
I understood, but the
Yeah.
connection of now we wouldn't be connecting a 2-story to a 2-story because we just don't have the real estate to do so. So now you have sort of 2-story buildings. How does that circulation work coming up, coming down? Where are now you reconsidering replacing each of the grade levels? So yes, you're adding classrooms, but what is the adjacency? What grade level of students need to be located in a certain way? You may have to look at the reorganization of all those spaces. But yes, that would be part of that exploratory work, is to determine if that is the best fit. Just looking at it, you are tight, so going vertical is at least a first pass evaluation.
Ms. Doyle?
Thank you. We've talked a lot about new buildings here. We haven't talked so much about
Nope.
expansion or renovations or additions and things like that. So can you describe some of the challenges? I mean, buildings that were built in 1950 are not the same as built in 2025 from a variety of perspectives, whether it's mechanicals, whether it's building materials, the size, shape, square footage, all of those things. What are some of the challenges of tying in a new build renovation with an existing building? I mean, we've heard anecdotally that there are issues with Wi-Fi, with adequate plugs.
Charging.
Yes, charging things. What are we kind of combating at that level?
Yeah, so all your buildings, let's just talk elementary, right? They were virtually all sister buildings, built in succession, right? And they were very efficient buildings at the time. They were very compact, right? It's floor to roof is, 12 feet, and they were pretty simple with classrooms, corridor, and some ancillary spaces. It had a central boiler room that was there, it provided heat, and it sort of looped through the building. Over the years, you've upgraded those to try to fit in air conditioning and improve air ventilation. But the envelope is the building envelope. You've replaced the roof and you've added insulation over to that, but basically you're constrained by that existing footprint. So how do you fit all of the other elements within this very sort of tight one-story floor-to-roof area? That's one of the real challenges, is how do I fit that? In many of these renovations, what end up happening, and these are called extension and alteration, the state considers them, they call it extension and alteration project. Those alterations require you to then put ductwork on roof, start creating new roofs over it. Now you're spending a lot of money to take things out, to put things back in for new. Your envelope is your building envelope. It's hard to add additional insulation. Yes, you could upgrade your windows, but there's just limitations with those buildings. You also have the existing structure that's in place, so you don't want to alter too much of the existing building, because you're going to get to a point of no return if you're going to try to rip it all apart. You also have phasing, which you have to consider in any of these scenarios. And some of this you may need to consider. If we're going to build new on an existing site or do a very extensive alteration project, and can you actually build while the students are there? There may be a point where the sites are too constrained to be able to do that, and you have to look at maybe, shuffling students around. So phasing of those scenarios definitely has to come into play as part of this evaluation of actually how do you do this work. So back to your question, the additional alteration projects are complicated. There's a lot to retrofit those buildings to be able to project them out 40, 50 years. It can be done, but you got to study it to see if you're at a point of no return, depending on its capacity and so forth.
I think just another point of reminder there, so sorry to interrupt, just another point of reminder there is, when you are doing these expansion and alterations or new additions, as Mr. Stein said, that other building envelope, there's still a lot of components that are going to be original to that building, like our piping and our electrical, which are in those walls. And I know that we've run into some of these situations in current situations where, as we spoke about at Pumpkin, where we have dedicated a large sum of money to it for that new addition, but in our original structure, there was a pipe that leaked, and caused some concern to us, and thankfully Mr. Bradbury and their team are all over, and they were able to catch it quickly and didn't cause a lot of damage. Thank you, Mr. Bradbury. But those are the things that you run into. So so as beautiful as that new structure looks, you still have these original piping and electrical components in our other part of our building that was not renovated, because as Mr. Stein said, you can't really get into those walls at that point. And those at any moment can go. So those are something that's like an ongoing concern. Keeps Mr. Bradbury up at night.
Right, I mean.
Thank you for listening.
Thank
you very much.
I mean, that's one of the conversations we've been having about the fire alarms and tying those into the ceiling and how difficult that's been. That's been an ongoing project that has been not my nightmare, it's Mr. Bradbury's nightmare.
Yes.
So, thank you, that's always helpful to hear that information.
So is renovate as new still a thing?
Yes,
Is that-
well, so, yeah, you may remember the conversation of renovate versus new, and the state has kind of gone back and forth in terms of some of their guidance. At this point, they don't necessarily give you guidance or point you in the right direction. They let each project sort of speak on the merit itself. But with the cost per square foot changing drastically over the years, and looking at your reimbursement piece, you begin to question whether or not new allows you more flexibility in the long range. So because the challenge with renovate is new, is you need to certify that everything in this building, all the piping, all the wiring, everything will last 20 years. Well, if you're in my seat and I have to sign that it'll last 20 years, I'm gonna pull it all up and put new down because I can guarantee that it's gonna do that, right? So that type of renovation, you're spending money to take things out, to put things back in new. And there's a certain point of no return, and you have to look at it. There's criteria that you go through to see whether or not it makes sense. We did a renovate as new for Berlin High School, okay? Challenge with Berlin High School, and they needed to get what's called a space waiver. Their building was about 25,000 square feet. We actually added additions onto their building and finished it in 2018. It was an $85 million project. They needed a space waiver because they only had like 1,100 students. Okay, but you had to work with what you have. We weren't going to knock down a third of their building because that didn't make sense. So in some cases, renovate as new is okay. You need to kind of waive some of the situations to see what's best. But if you were going to embark, and then whether it's the high school, the middle school, or the elementary schools, renovate as new, you need to touch everything. And then the question is, how do you actually do all that work and keep the students in session, or do you need to move them out? Because it's very
Right.
difficult
Well, I would
to be able
imagine,
to
yeah.
build under a renovate as new.
So you're using swing space?
So you would need swing space to do. Some people have other, there's other facilities to move over, which is obviously something that is disruptive and has to be managed. Some bring in portables, which are very expensive to do because we're essentially building a real classroom that has to have sprinklers and code compliant and ADA. So those are very expensive enabling things to do. That's why in many cases, like the Berlin High School, they added additions, that became swing space, and then I think we built that over like about 5 to 10 phases of mini phases to sort of move around the school. So those are very complex, elongated projects because you're doing things in sort of very small steps. So it could take, another year of a renovate as new versus building new. So all of that, again, is part of that site study that brings you back to making the right decision.
And a renovate is new, to Ms. Glennon's question, is you're still with the same envelope. Like Mathewson's still Mathewson.
You could add additions on, so you still could do renovate as new with additions. So, okay.
But your
there is
footprint
still-
is your footprint,
Yeah,
essentially.
the benefit of renovate as new really is that all of those items are eligible. Whereas an extension and an alteration project, if we wanted to replace certain elements, they don't consider those eligible. So the renovate as new says, since you're touching everything, we'll pay for all of it. If not, there's a percentage that's just not reimbursable. So you have to kind of weigh that. But if you were doing a full renovation, your goal is really to try to get as much and get renovation status, so you maximize the full eligibility.
So what I'm kind of hearing here is that, we can develop our initial plan, that might be a number of, we want X number of high schools, X number of middle schools, X number of elementary schools. And then the next step should be determining, it's still down the road, but determining where the sites might be.
Yes,
This is what I heard you
yes,
say.
that's what I'm saying. is now-
So supposing, Milford is pretty, Milford's pretty land-strapped, I think, in terms of buildable space. Would you agree with that?
Agreed, so, then you're gonna target, okay, where would we go? And you start going down that exploratory route to see whether or not you have the, where you would have the capacity. The Wallingford project that I mentioned, there wasn't any identified sites. Nobody raised their hand and said, we have this one perfect public site that's centrally located to place. So we did a test fit to put it at one of the high schools, but that didn't really work well, because now it was over at one side of town and trying to get from one end to the other, the transportation, that was of concern. So they made a decision that they wanted to go to one high school, but you know what? They don't have a site for it.
Right.
So whether there's a private one that's happening that they could purchase, and then the purchasing of sites, obviously, right, that takes it off the tax rolls, and it's pretty hard to find a site, 30 acres, that checks off all the boxes. So yes, you need to start with the site first to rule out, can you do this?
So we're not potentially talking about only one site, we're talking about
You
many
may talk
sites.
about two sites.
Well, if we're talking about elementary schools, we're talking about rebuilding elementary schools, we're talking about many sites.
That's correct, and
Because
which
it would-
one do you start with?
It would seem that our elementary schools, I'm not sure that many of them, if any of them, have property where we could do something like you build a new school in another part of the property and then knock down the existing school.
Based on the acreage that we see, knowing where you are with your infrastructure that's already in place of parking and fields and so forth, and your boundary and positioning close to neighbors that are surrounding there, where would you place the building? So the site is the way where to start.
Okay.
I have one more question.
Yes, Mr. Kola?
One of the options on the table is, a single new high school.
Right.
In that situation, we were talking about repurposing the existing high schools as middle schools. Are you aware of any special considerations? You ever done anything like that before? Because obviously the students are smaller. And are there any considerations that would have to happen in order to do that, just from a...
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's the buildings and the spaces are built in a different way, and, for those students, so it's not as simple.
So there'd be
It's
some
just-
level of work that would have to be
There's still a
done.
level of work that's needed. It's not as simple as let's just bust them all over and move our stuff
Right.
and we can open tomorrow. So, yes, there would need to be that configuration.
That's a good question. Thank you, Mr. Kola.
Is that true of if middle schools became elementary schools? As true?
If middle schools become, it would be, yes, it would probably be even
Even
more.
more so.
It would be even more so.
And you're still dealing with 1950 buildings.
Yeah.
Right.
We keep going back to that, still old buildings.
So, Mr. Stein, an entry point for this board would be, if you go to your last slide, would be to make some decision around concept or approaches, I think is the
Yes.
word that this board's been using. And then getting to that decision and then moving on to what would likely be an RFP process, because that would exceed our threshold.
Yes.
And finding a design firm that would help us with site selection.
Correct.
And then just working through the process and coming back to the board and saying, is this what you're dreaming and hoping for? And is this affordable? And then where in this process do you start to engage any community, not community, but like city official people? Is it in the site selection?
Site selection is key, because you need, you need staff of land use, public safety, public works, all of that to be part of this discussion. The public definitely should be aware, as it does have a community connection to it, as to where would any of that be placed. So absolutely, those should be part of your site selection
Right,
piece.
so these wouldn't just be musings of a third party that we hire, and there would really be on the ground work with city officials.
Yes, yes.
for questions? Ms. Wolf-Wayton?
I don't know if this is the appropriate time or not, but I'm really interested in what Mr. Bradbury has to say about all of this. Not to put him on the spot or anything.
About what part?
Just the, everything,
I think
right?
I know
Just
what
the
Mr. Bradbury would say.
the whole narrative, you know, I mean, he is most intimate with all of our buildings and sees the goings on as he is in there doing work with his staff every day. And, you know, I mean, we're making some really big decisions. And, you know, of all of the people, you are one of the biggest stakeholders in the decisions that we are making. So I'm just curious what is first and foremost in your mind as you hear, you know, the discussion that's going on.
Maybe your second thought, not your first.
Yeah. There you get the filter in.
Yeah, let's filter out that first thought.
Can you come up here so it could be
Sure.
on record?
Sure, this conversation has been a long time coming for me, because I'm in these buildings every day.
For how many years, Mr. Bradbury?
27 or something. It's been a long time. And an analogy that I've always had, going back to Ron Finaro, he was on the board, was that if you had a fleet of cars in your lot, how long are you gonna run these for? How long are you gonna keep this fleet of cars? At some point, you're gonna say, I'm done putting money into these. But we're at the Board of Finance tonight, and we have money going through, and I was ready to answer a question, where am I gonna put this money? I have mechanical rooms at Jonathan Law High School that are 62 years old. Older than me, that are still functioning. At Foreign, I have 5 mechanical rooms that are over 50 years old. Original equipment. So this town, city has to make a big decision on moving forward, because our vision is where do we want to be in 10 years? That's where I see this, is what road are we getting on to get to these schools, to where we want them. And it's a big investment. I mean, it's big money. And I see it. I could take as much money as you give me to put these back in, and we still won't touch it. So to find a 30-acre site to put a new high school in is going to be a challenge. But we need to upgrade these so you have a brand new something. I mean, I'm in, you know, we talk about pumping the light, you know, and I was a big advocate of why are we going back after the rest of the piping and stuff in the building. I mean, it's big. It looks beautiful, but we're in the tunnels fixing it and keeping it together, and that's what nobody sees. And our boilers are, you know, I have boilers that are coming up on 30 years old, and that list is ready to go. That's another piece of the, there's a lot here. We just need to plan. And that way we can follow it, and the next people behind me will keep going with that plan to follow up with the maintenance and the charts that Sean needs to replace all this equipment.
You're not going to be here in 50 years?
Well, Sean says I have to be here for another 60.
Yeah, you said 27, it's 27 more, right?
We're good at extending life around here, I'm just saying.
Yeah, but
Well, Mr. Bradbury, as long as you and I have talked, just want to make sure that we're all clear, that we've always talked about building new. That's what you're saying?
yes. I mean,
Building, whether it's high school, middle, or...
whatever.
Yeah.
We need something to get that fleet going. You want something to be a flagship of where we're headed. So at least we get the buy-in.
Something to start the process.
Something to start the process.
It is an interesting analogy, because we use it often and say, you know, it's similar, you know, you have a 1960 Chevy, and, you know, that car had heat, it didn't have air conditioning, right? So it's similar to your building. And yes, now if you want to renovate that 1960 Chevy, you know how much it costs to restore that Chevy. Now, to try to turn it into an electric high-performance vehicle is pretty impossible. So it's similar with your buildings, is there's certain constraints. Back to your question, is how much could you achieve with that? And so as you're projecting out another 50 years, does a newer building do that? If you do it right, yes. If you do it right, it gives you a much more longer piece. But to continue to just pick away at it, you're only sort of extending it out a certain amount of time if you're not touching all of it.
And I think, Sue, one of our challenges here on the board, to take your 60s Chevy analogy, I love. You can repaint it and make it shiny and it looks great on the front. If you drive it down the road, someone on the sidewalk is going to think it's fine. But they're not the ones actually in the car driving it around,
Right.
watching the engine light pop on and having to fill it up every 5 minutes because it's leaking something here.
Right.
It's rattling when you go over bumps, someone in the back just fell out. Like, they're not seeing what we see and what our students and our staff and our teachers and Mr. Bradbury and his team are seeing every day. So everything may look just fine, and it may seem like a silly waste of money to be putting this much into pipes that you're not gonna see. Like, my kid doesn't go to school every day and get impacted by the pipes. They actually do. That's not how cars work. That's not how buildings work.
Yeah.
So that's part of what our really actually important aspect is here, I think, is that we are responsible for the inside and the outside, not just what it looks like.
It's interesting that you say that, because the other day when I was leaving here, I drove by Harborside and there was something going on in the cafeteria there, which is a beautiful space, and it's got all the windows and you can see inside and it looks very modern, and then as I'm driving by, I'm remembering, the floods in the basement, and I'm remembering the tour last year where we, went into the ground floor, the basement level, and saw the very inadequate, tech space and music space and art space, and people don't see that. They see the nice shiny, this big beautiful, one area of the building that has, all the windows and the beautiful colors inside, and it made me think of exactly that. So.
But that's, even that addition is 1999. I know, because I was an 8th grader at Harborside when we got that space moved in. And so a lot of paint can make it different, but even at that
And
point.
like the new gym, we call it still the
It's
new
the new
gym at
gym.
Law.
Right, I
How old is it?
graduated. The
How
new
old is
gym.
it? 20?
91.
91.
91.
And when I
New gym.
graduated, new gym in 2003, it was still the new gym. We weren't allowed to walk on it, but still.
So, and the other big concern that I have, that I'm worried about, is what they're gonna design for you now isn't gonna last. The equipment isn't gonna last. So your preventative maintenance, your equipment replacement, that's all gonna skyrocket as you go, correct?
Yeah, so here's one thing that I didn't include in there, and that's actually a good point, is so with these investments, it's not just the cost to do the site work and build a building. It's the long-range maintenance over a 50-year period. And when you look at that, your upfront cost, the cost to build this building is probably about 30% of the overall cost. The long-range maintenance to operate, not only in terms of energy cost, but equipment cost over time, that's the long-range investment of these. So you have to be very sensible in the way that you do this. Some try to be very ambitious and say, I want the most modern, energy-efficient systems, but can you operate them? What's the longevity of the equipment that goes into it? What are the finishes I'm putting down? So when you get to that point, you have to make the right decisions and also recognize, can we maintain this building? Do we have enough money forecasted for that moving forward? Because you'll be in the same situation, 20 years after that.
A perfect example is they'll come to me with a super efficient design. UI gives me these projects all the time. Oh, this is going to save you huge money in your utility costs. And they will. But what happens is now my repair costs, the maintenance costs, I'm just taking the money's coming out of that bucket. So when I try and tell them that, it's not always this is the most efficient piece of equipment you can give me. Because I have to run it, I have to get parts for it, I have to have a guy that can maintain it. So there's a lot of things that go into it. Yeah, we can save some money on the gas, but now I'm buying the parts over here that I can't get or are very expensive to replace.
So, just to get a sense from the board, do we all have a realization now that this this is really a multi-phased process, and that what we're in right now is establishing some concepts. I think that's a good way to put it. And that, that's just the first piece of what will be a very lengthy process that will literally, go out years and years over the course of several. People are going to come and go, but the plan is still going to be there. Hopefully we'll move forward. Does anybody disagree with that, what I'm seeing here?
The kids deserve that.
Yeah.
They-
Well, that's the other point we haven't really talked about, is that the building needs can't meet our programming needs, which is the other half of it. We have the facilities cost, but are we able to best educate our children in these buildings for the programs that we want to aspire to? And that's what we haven't been able to do that. And so we have to remember that conversation too. It's like both in the future.
And those are conversations that have actually been going on since the last long-range plan, because the last long-range plan, we started talking about career pathways, and the board at the time directed the superintendent to, at the time, directed the superintendent to begin to develop a 6-12 continuum of career pathways, so the intent was always to include the middle schools in that work. And I think, what we're seeing now is we have limitations within our buildings to carry out those plans. So I think, that's part of this whole, it is part of this whole conversation.
That's where the education aspects come in.
Right. So, all right. We still have several items on our agenda to get through, so thank you, Mr. Stein.
You're welcome.
And
Thank you.
I think Mr. Stein had said he would be
Thanks, Pat.
available on
Saturday.
March 1st,
Yes,
Correct.
yes,
if need be.
yes.
Very good.
Yep.
Even though he doesn't live in Milford anymore.
I know how to get there.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
All right.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Dr. Broderick and Dr. Reynolds.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
And I'm going to ask Mike right now. Mike's going to need to be able to text somebody.
Mike,
Are you
are
there?
you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi. Can you identify somebody that you can text a couple of thoughts to? And let them know so that we have a way to, I don't know, one of you maybe?
Mike, you
Sean
want
or-
to text me?
Or Anna or
Does he-
Sue?
Yes, Mike.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah, I'll
email.
text you.
Can you text me, Mike?
We didn't hear who you said.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah, I'll text soon.
Okay, great. So our plan tonight was to get to that concept level and hopefully prepare well for Saturday, where you can be sharing this conceptual thinking with the community. So we wanted to start by coming to some closure on the, we know we're going to be presenting one or two high schools, not making a decision about that level. But we want to get to some closure on how many middle schools and how many elementary schools. And then we need to move into where you start, because that's going to be a big decision that you need to make. Not for you to make tonight, but for you to begin to think about the pros of starting with the elementary kids, the cons of starting at that level, the pros of starting at the middle school level, the cons, et cetera. So that, and then those can be the approaches that we present to the community on Saturday. Okay? So that's the thinking. So each of you is going to get 2 of these. 1, 2.
Do we have questions, Ms. Muller?
I have a question.
Sure.
Sorry, that was a little bit different than my understanding, so I think I'm just misunderstanding.
Okay.
What I heard you just say is that we're coming up to a concept, and then we're coming up with varying approaches on where to start,
Yes.
and those are what we are taking to the conversation on Saturday. My understanding is that where to start wasn't part of our question, but that what we are taking on Saturday is varying concepts, narrowed down concepts on Saturday.
Well, the guidance that we had was to think about starting at the elementary level, starting at the middle school level, starting at the high school level, and what that looks like over time, and what are the advantages of doing that and the disadvantages of doing that.
Okay, that feels very different than anything.
Yeah, I wasn't sure
was
that
my
that was-
expectation of what we were supposed to be doing, so I can adjust if that's what everyone else thought we were doing. 'Cause I thought we were narrowing down the options on footprints, on concepts.
We are doing that hopefully quickly first.
So on the agenda, Roman numeral 4D talks about discuss the pros and cons of where to start the facilities work, start the elementary, middle, or high school level, question mark.
Mhm.
Oh, and I'm gonna give you.
So is that what Dr. Broderick is referring to?
That's what she's referring to, yes.
Right.
So I guess the question is whether that piece of it would be going forward to the community conversation as well on Saturday. We might not be quite ready for that. It might just be the concepts then.
Well, let's
see
work
what
on the
happens.
concepts to start, and let's think about.
Well, and E, your last item is review agenda for
Mhm,
March
yeah.
1st, so maybe try to get through to that, and then the board can decide what you want to take forward on Saturday.
That works.
Sounds great.
Two of these were two for me and two for Mike, was
Two
that
for you and two
okay.
for Mike. So on your first sheet, please write down your ideal number of middle schools.
You hear that, Mike?
Yes, an ideal number of middle schools?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think you can start collecting when people are ready.
That's it? Just the number of middle
That's it.
schools?
I wrote that, that's just so I wouldn't get confused
Yeah.
accidentally.
Just the idea of
Think again.
I feel like we should play music.
Now we're just making them hurry.
Yeah, that's the idea. That's why I'm.
I have
Try to
mine,
bring
waiting
some
on
laughter
Mr.
to
Smith.
8:30.
That's 9 middle schools, is it?
You know, he's supposed to text you that number?
Yeah. Mike, you know you're going to text Sue your ideal?
My ideal?
Yes.
Oh, yes, he did. So ideal is a tricky word, Mike says.
Just text her a number.
Preference, okay.
For
Don't
God's
overthink
sake.
it.
Just text
So I'm
her a
going with
number.
your first number, Mike.
8:30. Don't make us come over there.
Stick these up here.
You sound like such a mom.
I will mom right now. It's 8:32. I will mom.
Believe it.
I'm not even hungry.
Somebody needs to.
I'm not even hungry. It's usually what causes it.
We need to bring a snack for you.
I have lots of snacks.
We've got,
I prepared.
got candy.
It's true. That will help. We all know that's a good snack.
Okay. All right.
Ideal emojis.
We can't read
that
those.
first and then we can discuss all of it. Okay, so write down your ideal number of elementary schools. We just have to move this forward.
It's 150.
Have you got my
Did you hear that one, Mike? Ideal number of elementary
Tracy,
schools.
you got a number for me?
Mr. Smith, did you
You're
hear
gonna write
that
your
one?
name on there and be like, oh, Tracy. Oh, God.
Yes, I did.
Perfect.
Already
Okay, thank
texted.
you.
Perfect.
Okay, have the rest.
You can think, everybody's saying that.
So colorful.
Michael. Okay. All right, so elementaries, there's a little bit more agreement. Everybody except one said 6 elementaries. So at this stage, we'll move forward with the concept of 6 elementaries. All right? A little less agreement at the middle school level. You have 7 who wanted 2 middle schools and 3 wanted 3 middle schools at this stage. So is the board ready to move forward with 2 middle schools?
No.
Well, why don't we hear from people that said 3 and
Okay.
see
You know, what it is maybe that's, I mean, I'd like to understand what it is that might be, what the concern is.
I can go, I was a 3.
Mhm.
I went into this process open-minded on our numbers for our different levels and our different schools, and as we've absorbed our projections data and the cost data and the everything that we have done in this process since the last however long we've been doing this now with all of our varying studies. And I've come to the conclusion that I support 3, period. And for me, it's because of a couple of different reasons. One, when we looked at the standard enrollment numbers at the middle school level, and we put that question to the survey that we did back in November, and the survey and the focus groups, and we talked about it during the community conversations. The standard number that came from that national level was a little bit higher than what our survey respondents and what our community has told us we want. And I think that is very, very important to note. I think that's a very key distinction, that we don't want to base our school decisions and our school sizing on national standards. We want it to be something that's relevant to Milford. We want it to be something that is actually appropriate and adequately sized to our community and the way that we envision our schools existing. And to me, that is the roughly, based on the enrollment projections of 1,200 middle school students in the 2033-2034 timeframe, that's giving us roughly 400 at each school, and that falls squarely within the range that 50% of survey respondents supported. And then again, we have supporting numbers coming from the focus groups, coming from the community conversations. And for me, that just makes sense, because when we, I know that in this process, we're not talking about specific schools at this stage, but I think when we're looking at 3 middle schools and we're talking about going down to 2 middle schools, it's very clearly that we're all talking about Harborside. And I find that to be a very important component of the Milford public school structure. I think that having a school in that downtown community is incredibly relevant. I think it provides a bridge across a district that is oftentimes characterized as having one side of town versus another side of town. I think it's very important to keep that central component that brings students together and then allows them to move into different high schools and integrate into different groups amongst the community. I think there's a huge value to that. I think there is a life and a vibrancy and a very Milford-specific value that is brought to bear by having a school community in our downtown area. And taking that out, I think, would remove an energy, it would remove a center point of activity for our families, for our students, that really brings the community together in a way that any other footprint would really not do. And we've addressed this question before over time. I think we saw it very, very loudly and clearly a couple of years ago when some budgetary process decisions tried to force the board's hand on this particular question. And I think that what we see, there are loyalties amongst all of our school communities. That's what you just get when you have a strong public school system that is centered around neighborhoods and communities. And I think that's incredibly important, and there's always going to be some change. We know that, we've heard that as well from the community, but I think that the specific piece to change should not be to take the Harborside community and disband it and try and regrow it elsewhere. I think it should be to strengthen it along with our other school communities at the same time. So to me, 3 middle schools is the right way to go for Milford at that roughly 400 projected enrollment. And I think that all the conversations that we just had about renovate to new or new builds, I think it's time to take Harborside to what it needs to be and to invest that money there so that Milford as a city can have the 3 school structure that makes the most sense.
I just want to take a moment because I meant to say this earlier and I think it's important to say. that as we're having these conversations, we're really talking about, we're focused on the buildings, the infrastructure versus the community within the building. And I think that's, because there are going to be loyalties no matter what you're talking about or what decisions we make. And I don't want to, give the impression that we are not keeping in mind the loyalties or the people in the buildings, but we are talking about, the actual buildings at this point and the infrastructure. And I have to wonder if the Harborside building and property can't even support making Harborside what it, quote, should be. I think there's a lot of challenges within the building itself, the physical infrastructure, and where it is that will be limiting in terms of what we can actually do.
I think that's a good point, and I think that based on the fact, that's why I asked for the clarification earlier on acreage sizes, it's actually the same size, roughly, as both of our other middle school properties, and I think that as we're looking at this process and what comes next, and that we move next to site selection and site evaluation, I think at a minimum, it is way too premature in this process to say it absolutely can't support it, let's go. I think that 3 middle schools from an infrastructure perspective makes the most sense for Milford, and I think that in terms of the actual physical potential limitations or opportunities at that site that just have not yet been realized because the money has not been put into that evaluation, that is something that at a minimum deserves to be done.
Question for you. So the 3 schools doesn't have to necessarily be, or does it have to be at the location of Harborside right now? Could a new school exist somewhere else for Harborside?
I think somewhere else, but I think that the 3 schools that balance across the different parts of town, somewhere else in the middle, sure, you got another spot in the middle, great. But to me, that particular location, just given what's already there, makes the most sense to make that level of investment to bring it up to that standard that comes out throughout the rest of this process.
So what does the board want to do at this point? You have 3 people who are saying 3 and have given a rationale. I don't know if anybody else wants to add to a rationale to keep 3. Or if you...
Yeah, I'll jump in.
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I think that really appreciate everything that Lauren just said. And also one of the things I'm struggling with is it feels like that's the middle of the pyramid, right? There's elementary, middle, and high school. And I feel like in a conversation about how we structure the school system, I think if we figured out the 1 high school or 2 high schools, that has cascading impacts all the way down. And so that's really where, if we're talking about 2 high schools, I think 3 middle schools probably make sense. We're talking about 1 high school, then it's a different kind of calculation about what happens with middle and elementary, and as we look at the whole continuum of our K-12 system.
Thank you. Anybody else? Yes, Megan.
So I'm struggling with this conversation about 3 here, because I haven't been able to identify that we have been able to give clear programming across the board at 3 middle schools. And what is clear is none of our middle schools support programming for the needs of our schools. So we were talking about extensive, at a minimum, renovations at all 3 middle schools. So we have this conundrum of, are we just circling, like, which circle are we trying to close here? Are we trying to close to make sure we can provide the best programming opportunities? Are we trying to close budget efficiencies of what is best, and like, how do we achieve that? I am for 2 schools. I think we have to continue with one direction, pick one, and then we come to the next part of what seems pretty clear from the conversation we had this evening, that we need more information about what's going to progress at these sites, if it's even available to do this. Because I don't know at Harborside how to add onto that school realistically, other than how it's been done now. And so I'm going to talk very, like,
is it even realistic to bring it up to par to West Shore and East Shore? And I think even with par to East Shore and West Shore, we are leaving significant deficiencies on the table at that level. And that might be the cost of a new middle school to bring Harborside to a sufficient level, is what I've gathered from this conversation. So then, why are we gonna bother renovating?
Not that we renovate, I think it has to be.
I think,
it's so
right,
much
I
so
think
far behind.
that Ms. Muller makes a good point. But I think another piece of this is the programming piece and the voice and choice that we've talked about, the career pathways, and whether, how does a school of 400 kids work with that? How is that supported? Is that a challenge? I don't know if there's something that administration can share as far as the numbers are concerned.
Well, during this conversation, what's coming to mind immediately without having a lot of time to think, is our goal of increasing voice and choice at the middle school. And really wanting to start career pathways in 6th grade with an exploration, and then some more definitive electives starting in 7th and 8th grade. So the rule of thumb when it comes to secondary education is the smaller the student body, the fewer options and electives you can provide, because you are distributing fewer students into more choices, and that class size goes down, and now that there's a significant inefficiency, so you'll need more FTEs for fewer number of kids, and you run the potential, which we already have, at our middle schools of class sizes that are smaller than your kindergarten and 1st grade rooms. So the smaller the middle school, the fewer electives and opportunities for choice that we would likely be able to run, unless this board suddenly adopts it's okay to have teeny tiny class sizes in middle school. And then hopefully we could have a conversation about reinvesting that into like the primary grades, where we would prefer to have smaller classes, but that's for another day. But it does become highly inefficient and likely diminishes electives and options for kids, the smaller the student body. And that applies to high schools too.
And I think that absolutely makes sense. Swinging to the very small side of the pendulum never benefits anyone on the programming side. The question is, at a roughly 400 student body count, is that so far swung to that side of the pendulum as to make that point exist? Or have we not yet fallen into that? We're not talking about 200 kids and a
We're hitting
6,
it
7,
now,
8.
so I'm just bringing up numbers for a second.
Yeah, sure.
That's why I'm on my keyboard.
Yep.
So right now, he's whispering in my ear. Just go ahead and say it.
So we're seeing it right now with
Yeah.
art courses, for instance, at the middle school level. We have a 2D, 3D art, which were designed to increase that voice and choice in the arts courses. However, with it spread so far out, we're seeing very low class numbers, 7, 8 kids, 9 kids.
So we're collapsing that for the
Right.
coming year. So we started a voice and choice track in art, and we're having to roll back because you just can't run an art class with 7 kids.
What kind of head count do we have now with the middle schools?
Yeah,
Oh,
look at
that's
that.
okay.
394,
I can't move
399.
fast
total?
enough for you guys.
Just, I mean, if with what Lauren was saying, we're gonna shoot for 400 per school, I'm just curious as to what we are now.
Let me bring you-
Because we're about,
Just under that.
For
Like,
yeah, we're
So that bring you numbers as of right.
That's the 10-year out projection is.
Yeah.
that.
right.
So, yeah,
It's about
it's
that
like
now.
399.
399,
Hold on,
394,
hold on.
330.
Hold on.
You put it in this. It was 402.
Well, those are
No,
the
those are the
2030
projections, we're talking the actual enrollment.
figures.
one other question I had, if we decide to move forward with only 2 middle schools, does that eliminate any research and analysis we would do about whether or not it's worth to renovate a building for Harborside? Does it just get removed from the conversation entirely? Do we even research about it if we decide to take it off now? I mean, we don't know the cost. I mean, I don't, I'm relatively new, so maybe everyone else here does, but do we know the cost of what it would take to build new?
40.
Oh, to build new, no. To
Or
renovate
renovate or-
40, 40 million.
Mr. Brennan may.
Bureau Veritas.
Roughly, those are
Yeah.
coming up in
Approximately
the next
1,000
parts of the study where you
per
have to look
square
at the
feet.
site specifics.
But we don't have that data yet.
Well, we have the report that Bureau Veritas did that gives us the,
To bring it to par.
right, that about 40 million it was.
Rough.
So as of the projections that are in the budget that the board adopted, next year East Shore is projected to be at 353, and Harborside is projected to be at 393, and West Shore is projected to be at 387. That's next year. And then in the projections that were done for us by SLAM, highest enrollment in 10 years, if you want to look at a 10-year scope, East Shore's at 404, Harborside's at 415, and West Shore's at 425. So using the about 400 number is correct at its largest.
So going back to the directives that were given 10 years ago to start career pathways on the 6-12 continuum, that with the smaller middle school class sizes, that can prove a little challenging, is what I'm hearing you say.
I mean,
In
if
terms
art
of
is
time.
our test, we will just have to be able to swallow the fact that our class sizes are going to be very small if we start building out electives. So when we start talking about tech ed, like let's just take, that's the most concrete, I think everyone can visualize tech ed, right? We would like minimally, we've envisioned together 2 tech ed spaces at each middle school. That doesn't exist currently, there's only 1, so we'd have to find a space for that. We're already thinking West Shore, there is no more space at West Shore. Carrie Karamis constantly is asking for, can you just build an extra classroom? Or we're at the point where we may take the workout room and collapse it and put a classroom in there. So that'll start to impact programming. So in tech ed, we'd like to not just have 2 tech ed spaces, but then you start thinking about what we're doing at the high school. So we are considering like a CAD pre-engineering space. So that would be like a regular classroom with more techie kind of things. You know, coding and then AV, all those pieces of tech ed. So one that talks about, that considers space. But 2, right now the kids just have tech ed.
You're talking middle school, right?
Middle
Still?
school. But we just added pre-engineering, right?
Grand
So let's say we start to add maybe 2 more, and that gives kids 4 spaces to go to. We have the same number of children going into now 4 spaces, and class sizes are even smaller.
At 3 different schools.
At
Having
3
to
different
mimic that at
schools.
3 different schools.
So one could argue that that is a gross inefficiency, because now we're hiring more FTEs to teach the same number of kids, and then class sizes, even though choice has increased, which is good educationally, right? That's the direction we want to go in, specializing, helping kids get on a trajectory. Now you're looking at class sizes that are so small. But if you were to increase that, let's say you go down the road of 2. Now I have many more kids in, let's say, 7th grade with 4 options. It becomes more efficient because my FTEs are higher, but I have more kids in those rooms. And you could support spending that money on electives and FTEs. When you've got, let's say, 4 tech ed classes with 18 kids, as opposed to 4 tech ed classes with 10 kids. It's a hard decision for us, and we do this, we've been doing this each year. So do you run the art 2D, 3D? Do you keep it? Yes, because we're committed to choice, but this year we just can't, so we're collapsing it. And that's what we would face if we keep running the smaller middle school. That would just be a fact that this board and administration would have to agree that that's the sacrifice we're making. Because on the high school side, let me give you an example of a decision that we have made, that we've decided we're running AP classes, whether there are 6 kids or 28. And that's a commitment to just higher level courses. We've said that out loud, You have supported it, we advocate for it, and it seems like our school community supports it, because no one has ever said, collapse AP courses. But because we have schools of about 700, we can offer a very long list of AP courses. I've been in a district where the school was much smaller and we had half the list of AP courses. So you have to make some decisions on the programming side when thinking about how big should your middle and high school should be.
And it's interesting when you're talking about needing to collapse or potentially stretch out to smaller numbers across those middle school levels at the current levels where they are now, given that the timeline we've talked about for these massive levels of renovations, these rebuilds. The renovate to new, maybe, in some of the nicer places, the full rebuild at somewhere, potentially like Harborside, that needs it. When we're looking at 10 years down the road, around the time some of these would start to actually exist, all of those enrollment numbers are higher. All of those enrollment numbers are higher than they are today on the projections. They're all up around 400, and you just said there's 350, 380 something.
Well,
at our
Harborside's
schools now.
only 18 kids larger.
Right.
So
But
it's
in
about
terms
the
of the
same.
projection and the trend and the direction that they're moving,
The only school that's higher is East Shore.
And there's not enough to offset. I mean, you have an extra 18 kids over 3 classes.
So it's fair to say that Harborside and West Shore are about 400. That's fair to say for next year. So the one school that is significantly higher by 50 children would be East Shore. So I would say that what we're dealing with, the challenge we're faced right now with student voice, I'm sorry, I know I interrupted you, but I just.
no, that's fine, I'll continue.
Want to finish my thinking,
Uh-huh.
because sometimes I lose it, like right this second.
That's okay.
So the challenge we're facing right now with, do we run the voice and choice classes or the electives, et cetera? At least at 2 of our middle schools would be the same as it would be in 10 years. Less so at East Shore, but, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just to say, I think bringing it up to the higher level of what we are considering here right now. Voice and choice, very important. Programming, very important. We don't want kids to lose opportunities because there are so few of them in a building. And we just talked about how the enrollment is roughly going to be about the same. So we're not shrinking anything. I think that to make a decision at this point in time without the type of information and the detailed analysis of the site potential that may or may not exist for that third middle school site, and to say, we envision a potential time where the enrollment is the same, but somehow the opportunities we think will not be enough, and therefore it is worth taking an entire school and retiring it with all the second, third order effects that would require, at this exact moment, to me, is not the right choice. To me, it is too early to be able to make that decision based on the fact that we'd rather have 18 kids and not 10 kids in 7th grade tech ed, number 3. I don't think, to me, that is important, absolutely, but I don't think that is a valid enough reason right now to make a decision to go from 3 middle schools to 2, when we do not have the rest of the information necessary to make that decision in a more comprehensive way.
Just to kind of piggyback off that, I mean, there's a perfect loop on this.
Exactly.
That says we establish our concepts. If we eliminate one middle school now, we've established that. We do our site selection and then we move on. But if we keep all 3, we move on to site selection, then we can collect more data. And if it doesn't work out, we loop back.
And then we get to the educational specifications, and if we find out at that point in time in the process that there actually is going to be a significant enough detriment to the programming opportunities available to our middle school students based on everything else that we've collected, we got this nifty little loopy thing. It's a very skinny little arrow, by the way. Normally that is a much more significant arrow to indicate a loop, but it's there.
But you can't miss it.
But we have you really can. You have the opportunity to come back at that point, and it's easier to go from 3 to 2 than to go from 2 back to 3. From a community perspective, because 3 is the status quo. So it's easier to make the change later than it is to change and then unchange.
I don't know what the will of the board is at this point, in terms of what you want to bring to the community. But clearly, you're still divided on this with good suggestions on both sides. I think we have clear direction for elementary that that shows some change anyway from the first conversation.
I don't think we should be bringing this conversation to the community on Saturday. I think it's a information decision, not a desire conversation of like perceptions, because I think at the end of the day, it comes down to site suitability, since to some extent they appear to be similar, but there are individual challenges at each site. So I prefer two, with the assumption we're closing one. And I'm not even saying it's the one that we've all said it's going to be closed. I'm saying, and then we make a determination based on the information that comes forward. But I don't think it should be going, I think we need to focus purely on the 1 to 2 high schools on Saturday.
Well, I actually think it is an important community point to still gain information on.
What do we know, what do we know about the enrollment for Saturday? Or do we know if it's a lot of the same people coming back? If it's a new crowd altogether?
We have 50 people signed up right now, but we're doing a push tomorrow. After this board decides on the agenda, we're going to do a refresh.
So I don't know that they,
Yeah.
I don't think, did
We
you?
collected names.
Repeaters.
Right, but I don't know that you're comparing names. Did you ask if people had attended the first one?
I didn't.
Yeah, so,
But there are some names on here that were not in attendance.
No, I'm just wondering whether it is worth continuing with, if not the same conversation as the first time, with a version of that one, rather than bringing the concepts up, because it does seem really early to be presenting concepts.
Or to be presenting two very limited concepts. The 1 and 2 and the 2 and 3, those 4 permutations with the 6 elementary schools, I think makes a lot of sense.
Well, maybe it's a backward design question. What does this board hope to get out of Saturday, and for what purpose? And is your trajectory still trying to make a decision of phase 1, first box, by end of April? So maybe start with pondering, what do you want to get out of Saturday?
Well, what was the agenda? So it says review agenda. Is that already, is there a concept already set for what you thought Saturday might look like? Or are we giving it to you tonight?
No, I felt that it was very difficult to even begin to think about the agenda for Saturday before we heard from David.
Okay. Okay.
And heard your thinking tonight, because the community, I think, said pretty clearly in January that status quo is not okay. And I guess I would expect that they might want to hear what you're thinking in terms of not being status quo. You definitely wanted to continue the 1 versus 2. We thought it would be really helpful to think about where you start. Do you start at the elementary level, do you start at the middle school level, or do you start at the high school level? And get the pros and cons of that and have them engaged around that. But we haven't gone there yet.
The invitation, or the save the date that we sent out, states, join us at the Board of Education, as the Board of Education narrows down its options for its long-range facilities plan, which is slated to be finalized this spring. Your feedback is crucial in shaping the future of our schools.
I think in terms of where we start, to that question, which now feels super relevant, so I get all the pieces and how we fit together now. I think it goes back to what Mike described as the pyramid. And this is something I remember saying during our first workshop. It feels like the structure of the city and the structure of our schools starts with, do we have 1 high school or 2? And then it goes from there. If we have 1 high school, do we have 2 feeder middle schools? Or do we have 1 high school with 3 feeder middle schools that each have 2 feeder elementaries? Is that what the flow is going to look like for students in the district? Or is it going to look like the 2 high schools with 3 now? Or are we going to divide the whole city right in half and go straight up each half? I think those are concepts that, to me, start at the high school level.
I think in terms of where do we start, that the thinking was, where do we start with the actual, where would the plan start? Would we start with renovating or rebuilding elementary schools first, middle school's first, high school's first.
Different version of START, sorry.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, different
that's-
version of
yeah,
START.
And because really, I think it's important for everyone to remember, and the elephant in the room is that the whole impetus for this process was the Board of Finance and the Board of Aldermen, Mayor Gennatasio specifically when he was an alder, asking us to create a long-range plan in order to realize operational efficiencies to our annual budget. And I think it's important that we I keep that in mind in terms of, every year we're grappling with putting a budget forward, an operating budget forward, and having to justify, the need, and yet, they're, coming back and saying, you need to, this isn't sustainable. You need to rein in your operational budget. The only way that's going to happen is by finding economies of scale and efficiencies within our, staffing, maintenance, those types of things. And I think in terms of where to start, for me, that's an important piece of where to start, because I think we need to show that we're, serious in finding some relief to our budget sooner than later. And if you start with a plan that says the very first thing we're going to do is build a new $300 million high school, I don't know that that's palatable to people. I think starting at a lower cost. So
Why don't, Jack, you want to take, I think if we start doing this, you get a sense of, because you're giving pros and cons.
So the pros and
now
cons,
to
okay.
it.
Yeah.
So we want to make sure we.
Sean, the first thing I wanted to tell you, I think you got some aces, not only on permanent staff, but with David here tonight and Pat. Mary and I had the pleasure of meeting with Pat as part of our interviewing around the district, and you have a real ace on your hands, and some of the things he's saying, whether it's about automobiles or whether it's about broken or parts, good parts first can't replace them, cheaper parts that are coming out. There's so much wisdom in what's on the room. I just hope you aren't totally depressed after hearing all of the things that have to be done. We've all been through it, and it works its way out, and you gotta go step by step and incrementally. But it's a huge project. I mean, you could tell from the things that both these guys are saying and that you've been hearing all around. The overall steps of this, 7 years worth of steps to get a building built, that's brutal, and it's reality. And I think we can do it in less than 7 years. But the fact is, the project, getting the thing through the state, getting it through the architects, getting all the approvals, the permits, the land, is tricky as heck. And Warren, I know that you felt concept was where we were. I agree, but on the other hand, sequence is so important. I think we were killing ourselves with one high school or two high schools. That might be 15 years away if you decide you're going to build the elementary first. I think some part of the sequence here is pretty important. And in my thinking for the past few weeks, it looked like, if you want to start at the elementary, let's talk about it. If you want to start at the middle school, let's talk about it. If you want to start at the high school, let's talk about it. But this is 0 years to 20 years. And we need to have some projection. But when you're going 15 years out, it's going to be so many new people and so many different rules. It's great to have a plan. But the plan for dinner tomorrow night is iffy, let alone what we're going to do for schools in 15 years. I was hoping that by March 1st, we get it down to 2 alternatives. I don't know that we're going to get it to 2 alternatives, even with some variation within them. But if you have to have a community conversation, if you decide you want to do that, I don't think it can be a rehash of the last one, or people will get annoyed. It's got to be, what have you done to advance things further from the last one? And what do we like the community to contribute on it? I think it wouldn't hurt. And just to get a feeling, like the stickies. Do you want to start at the elementary level, or do you want to start at the middle school level, which the conversation other times was over at the high school, 1 or 2. And then we went tonight to middle school. Are we set at elementary? Are we going to 6? Are we going to start building at the elementary level? And if we are we going to build 3 of them? I think I was tempted to ask David, And as an architect, he'd probably rather you build them one at a time and build them differently. I think you can build one plan, save an architect fees, and build 3 schools just like it. We did that in Amherst a lot of years ago, 2 just like it, and they were absolutely exemplary. But I think a decision needs to be made, and our job here is just to help you guys, support you as you make your decisions. I think you need to get to the decision. You want to start at the elementary, start at the middle, or do you want to start at the high school? And if it started at the high school, we need to come up with how we're going to get to 1 or 2. Is that part of the community conversation? If it isn't start at the high school, if it started at elementary, the hell with the high school. We can get to that later. You can do 2. You can renovate the 2 you got. Or you can consolidate and try to find land as you can build 1 flagship. But I heard David say clearly, the first step is high school, middle, elementary. Which is it? The second step is site. And, you know, I've got his quotes on there. I think that's great. The concept is vital, but within a parameter, and the concept will vary a little bit, depending on which of these 3 you want to start with. I've heard that so actively debated in here, and sometimes not debated, but you could hear it. Start at the elementary. If it started at the elementary, I think you build 3, close 3, and you come down with, or close, I don't know how many, 3 or 4, come down with 6. I think you got to build 3 elementary schools, and I think the worst thing you can do, frankly, as a process is, we're quick, build 1, and you'll, everybody in town pats themselves on the back and says we took care of the schools. 1 elementary takes care of 1/8 of your student body for 4 years. 1 high school takes care of all 5,300 of your student body. But I think some decisions need to be made like that.
So that's why we were thinking of pros and cons of each
For each.
place. Could be what you could engage your community around on the first. Does that make sense to you?
Not yet.
Well, maybe we should just start doing it.
But if you could come closer to 1 plan, 2 plans, some plans, and then get them to have pros and cons if that's what you want to have with small groups in. But it's getting pretty close to March 1st. And I felt like I had to come here and push a little bit. So throw things at me, that's okay. But I think to facilitate your process, we got to help you move forward pretty quick if we're really going to get the community together in March 1st.
Can you clarify the task, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
So the community has to decide, or you have to decide where to start. And do you start at the elementary level with construction elementary schools?
First
Do you
on the left.
start at the middle school level with whatever you want to do at that point? Or do you start at the high school level with 1 or 2 construction projects of high schools? And then we can talk about what works if you start at the elementary. You have some of your oldest buildings at the elementary level, that kind of thing. So what would be great about starting at that level? What would be disadvantageous about starting at that level? Same with starting at the middle school level, and same with, we'll probably have more conversation about this, but as Jack points out, if you are not going to start at the high school level, that's a decision then about whether to go to 1 or 2, that it can be much farther down.
Kick that can down the road a little bit.
I don't know that I agree with that. I mean, I don't see any reason why we can't solidify a concept.
For the high school.
I mean, ultimately for all 3 pieces. I mean, we've said 6 now for elementary school.
Right.
I think, I was hoping on Saturday to hear more from the public on the high school piece, because the high school piece, they were very divided at the last community conversation. So I'd like to try to hone in on that at the community conversation on Saturday to see if we can get a clearer sense from the community as to where they stand on this.
So just to supplement the point that you're making, I tend to think it's the same price for the next 5-6 years. If you build 1 high school or a super renovation of 2, I'm not sure that's any different in cost, and Sean can probably work out the numbers quick,
Well,
than
it's not
building
just
3
about the
elementary,
cost, though.
than building 3 elementary
Correct,
schools.
right.
60 million each, 180 million. for three brand-new elementary schools. So whichever way you decide to go, it shouldn't be primarily money. It should be a little bit, what's best for the kids of this town? What's best for the city we call Milford? And that's one of those three up there, I think. And
But
then we
don't-
can put meat on the bones.
But don't we have to think about both simultaneously, like
Yes.
giving them equal weight, right? So if we're deciding, okay, if we decide that we want to start with the elementary schools, for example, okay, that I would think would be something that we could begin to implement quicker than something with the middle schools and the high schools, right? And there does seem to be some level of urgency if one of our edicts is to save money, right? Start figuring out how you're going to save money.
See, like, I agree. I think that there are tiers of ways information needs to be filtered. And so I'm just saying things, I'm not committing to anything. If we went to one high school, that is not a decision that will be made in, we will not find a site, get the money, bond it, plan it, set it for 6 years. So for 6 years, are we doing nothing? So to me, the high school piece is the last piece because it has so much lead time if we make a decision to consolidate. Because we aren't even saying we're consolidating, it's the last of it. And we are doing current renovations, so to make these schools to be as best as they can in this current moment. So then we roll back, in my mind, I go middle school, personally because I've gone to 2 middle schools and whatever positioning of the 2 middle schools, we figure out additions to meet the needs currently as it is, in the same time ramping up the elementary school piece where we get the bonding, we get the plans. I agree with Jack, 1 plan, 3 schools, and have those done middle before we project to that. That's how I see everything, because in a grand, lucky time frame, I could see us pushing a capital improvement plan, a piece going forward in the next year or so, or whenever we do the capital improvement plan. So that is a timing factor of what is the speed of which we can progress and move the plan forward, because I don't think we are following our edict or the best for the Milford if we push the can to make a decision for 4 years until we have a school built. We can't make a decision to retire a building for 4 years.
And no one's ever agreed with me before, so I'm not sure how exactly to react to that. But I think that I could also make the argument of decide it's the high school, and then later decide we're going to renovate the 2, heck out of the 2 of them.
Yeah.
Or build a new one. But then it's the land. It's, as he said, the next question then is where the hell do you do it?
But-
Can you
And I
find
mean,
out?
if you're doing a land study in parallel with everything else, we may find there's no site, period.
That's
We
some
may
people
flush
are
our
saying
hand.
those.
It
That's
could be done
rudely
parallel,
good.
though.
Two people
So
on
that
the
can
Alders,
happen
I
in
think, tell
parallel.
us we
It can
can
be
find
done
a site.
parallel.
Okay, but let them discuss that, okay? Yeah.
It can be done
Let the
parallel.
board
I mean,
talk
we
about the pros
can,
and cons.
we can create our concept, which, includes 1 or 2 high schools, and if it were 1 high school, you can then start the process to look for property, do your site work simultaneously to when we're working on other pieces.
Right.
It doesn't have to happen in a vacuum.
And for the purposes of Saturday, we can say that 1 or 2 question, okay, if it is gonna be 1, what does the rest of the footprint look like as it flows down from there to those other levels? If it's gonna be 2, what does that then look like as it flows down?
Well, I think leaving something too open-ended is dangerous. I think we need to have some specifics to bring to them. Would you agree with that?
What I think works best for a community conversation is saying, this is the issue. And this is what some people say about it and what other people say about it, just in terms of really fleshing out the pros and cons and let them jump off of that.
So should we be focusing on just building pros and cons lists for the multiple plans and presenting multiple plans, or should we really be trying to lock in one singular plan right now?
Well, no, not 1.
I think the agenda has exactly what you wanted to do. Going back to Mr. Scobie, you wanted to discuss pros and cons of 1 high school, 2 high school, so you could take that to Saturday, right?
Right.
Then you also want to talk about pros and cons with where to start, which is what you're doing right now.
Right.
And on C, you want to talk about how to move forward number of elementary and middle schools so you can bring it forward to the community. So your agenda here outlines what you're hoping to get done tonight in order to bring to Saturday, right? So maybe we could try to tick off some of these items on the agenda,
Thank you.
okay?
Which may or may not, I mean, you know.
Or the board may say, we can't get through all that tonight, and we only want to take X and Y. But just to bring some more clarity as to what is it that you want the board to decide tonight, Doctors Reynolds and Broderick, and what we want to land the plane on, because it's 9:20, right? So,
Right, and we've been working on this.
right. So let's be explicit about what part of the agenda you're working on, so we can bring a close to that, so we can then go to another part of the agenda and bring a close to that. So
Right.
on the agenda, are you on
Well, we were.
4D?
We were working on D.
Okay.
But if you want to spend more time on one or two high schools, we can definitely spend some time there. I thought we were taking the one or two high schools we knew we were taking that to the community.
Yes. You are, but you just said that you want to give the community a launching point.
Right. And we have
So-
some of that from the last time, but we
Okay.
can do that again.
Is the decision on one or two irrelevant as to whether it comes in 15 years or it's fine with me.
It is irrelevant, yes, it's
Okay.
just one or two.
Okay.
period.
So let's bounce that question to the board. Does the board feel like you've had enough discussion on the pros and cons of 1 and 2, or would you like more dialogue before Saturday on that?
I don't feel like we need more dialogue before Saturday. I feel like we can take that question to Saturday, but I think it is an important question to be answered in the ultimate production of this plan.
And there's probably
Now,
enough
not 10
that we
years from
could
now.
pull from your previous conversations to
Yes.
create the launching point.
And
Which is
from
the
the
pros and
last
cons.
conversation, and you
Yep.
have been gathering information that can
Yep.
also be woven into that.
Yes,
So
that's a conversation that just needs to extend
Okay.
to the community conversation
The
again on
checklist
Saturday.
person thing in me, all right, so we've done 1A, 4A and 4B.
Yes.
Okay, so we have enough on B to take to Saturday. So is this board agreeing that to Saturday, we're going to take the conversation of 1 or 2 high schools to the
Yes.
community?
Yes, with the supporting information that we've already done.
Is that a good yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Anybody know on that?
Not that there's a bad, is there? I'm running out of words. It's late.
I have a
Okay.
question. Are we bringing up at the beginning of the session on Saturday, the results of, it might be a different group, there might be the same people, but to recap, in case they didn't watch the meeting, obviously, that when we got the results of the summary, we're gonna recap that at the beginning so that people are all on the same page about what was January's results.
My sense is that it would make sense to do that as a fleshing out of the issue. So, last time we heard this and this and this, instead of putting them through a regurgitation of everything that happened last time. It
Okay.
just, these are the key points about this issue.
It's just part of the
that
data
were
we've
raised
gathered.
last time.
What worries me is there's some rhetorical things that we may not want to touch or we may want to touch about that choice. Do you do anything with dollars? Do you do anything with prenatal kids? Or may be ready for the high school, but if it's an elementary school, they better be prenatal because it ain't going to be there till 5 years from now. I think that was a shock the last Saturday for parents to realize, wait a minute, my kid's 3 years old and there's not going to be an elementary school even built by the time they're in elementary school. So like there's different rhetorical things around that choice that you need to decide what you bring out and what you don't bring out.
Can we make a decision about whether you're going to invite Mr. Stein to the meeting and give a presentation, which may be beneficial?
Can-
Let's keep going
Yes,
down
but
your
not
agenda
yet.
checklist.
But
I just want to work through this checklist.
I know you do.
I'm being really anal about this.
That's fine. But I think,
You can ask that question again under 4E. I'm just trying to bring some order to the meeting.
I know.
So sorry.
I feel like the reason why I asked it there is because it helps with some of these conversations, because some of the big questions will be answered by his discussion
So
that we are not handling.
if you build the agenda, then we could decide, does Mr. Stein come, yes or no, what does he do? What's the role of Mary and Jack? What's the role of right? Is that okay?
So big picture, Mr. Stein, we've solidified him for that meeting, and he is willing to do a presentation, he's willing to
Yeah.
answer questions.
He's locked
willing
in.
to, however we decide, because we didn't know what we're gonna have him do, we just got him.
The content of that
Locked in.
presentation, TBD, 4E.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks for the support there. Okay. 4C, discussion and action related to the number of elementary and middle schools in order to finalize proposed approaches to be moved forward to the community conversation. So would we say that the number of elementaries?
So is that,
We heard 6.
right, and do we,
Yep.
I kind of feel like that's, I don't know that we need to get any more input on that. I don't know how other people feel about that.
Are
I
they not
think-
gonna ask us how that's gonna work out?
Well, but we don't, that's not what
We don't
that's
know
not on
yet.
the table
So
yet,
that's
that's
not-
later,
that's the whole
that's.
thing.
We have the
is-
same
it's-
question, that comes
yeah.
later in the
Well, how
process.
that's gonna work out will be part of phase 2.
Yeah.
You know, because it's,
Right.
we clearly heard from him tonight that it's a much longer process. So we feel that 6 elementary schools is the right number for Milford, you know, as long as they're right-sized.
Yes, and I'm
So-
afraid that if we get into it, the first question's gonna be, ooh, which two? What, you know, because then it can get emotional.
That's the point
Then
of
it
that
could
other,
be.
that other presentations, we don't know. It's all
Exactly.
site evaluations.
This is
So
one
I
of the
don't-
most
Yes.
important parts of his
Years
presentation.
down the line.
Yeah, so I don't know
That's
that
fine.
we need to bring that to the conversation at all.
I don't think it's
That
part
might-
of the discussion conversation, but it's a data point as they are considering the other pieces.
And that might be partially determined by finding the sites. Where are they gonna be located if you're gonna build some elementary schools, and which schools therefore get
6.
closed?
That could go side.
So where we, we hearing from the board that you don't want to bring the topic up on Saturday about elementary?
I think we should make a statement that we've
Yes.
gone to
Decided on
6,
six
and we
is
will
the right
continue the
number.
discussion about
Right.
site plans and doing all the planning
Okay.
accordingly,
Based on projections, based on data, 6 appropriately
space and size.
provides for our students going
Okay.
forward. Details to come.
And it's also responsive to what you heard from them last
Right.
time.
Right.
Okay, and then the middle school part, is that in the 2 to 3 land?
I think it's in 2 to 3, and I would like to hear community conversation on it, secondary to the 1 to 2 high school piece, or as part of that.
With the community conversation, just because I wasn't part of the last one, do we pitch pros and cons to them and then have them discuss, or they just, we don't want to influence them, so we just say it and let it go?
Got a question.
We
That way.
pitched the pros and cons.
Wait, there is a little foundation, but not from you guys.
They
It's
do.
like,
We're the scribes,
Yeah.
so it's.
Oh, yeah, I didn't mean,
Right, and
I didn't mean us,
that's-
I
yeah,
meant like
yes,
the
yes.
presenters.
There's like, as
Yeah.
part of the
Just an overall.
overview, and then there's, in each room, there were some guiding questions.
okay, so does 2 to 3 go in front of the community Saturday?
Yes.
Okay, so we
I
have.
heard that.
Yeah.
2 or 3.
Great.
Excellent. 4D, discuss the pros and cons with where to start the facilities work.
What have you gone?
I'd like to go back on it if you'd let me.
Nope.
Just to- But 2 or 3, it's the same argument as before. What's the rhetoric? How much does it cost to do this, or is it an elementary
It's the board's
school?
decision on whether to move forward with 2 or 3, right?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, so that's what we're doing.
That's what they decided.
Move
And-
forward on 2 or 3.
And having that as part of the discussion on
Yep.
Saturday.
Am I-
We may
did
hear
I
the s- We may
capture
hear the
that?
same stuff we heard before, and that's fine, we're just gonna hear it again.
Yep. Okay. All right. Is the board okay to move forward with pros and cons on this?
So one thing I remember hearing, so I'm not sure how this is going to fit in, so this may be part of E, but there was a lot of conversation about wanting to have some information on the dollars, so, okay. that's fine.
And that's what I would wonder, I mean, David talked, Mr. Stein spoke about really big picture, $1,000 a square
Right.
foot kind of language. So I don't know whether it's going to get more granular than that.
Well, under E, I think we should talk about what, if any, artifacts do we provide the community?
Yes.
Because last time we decided no Chromebooks and not a lot in the folders. And it's impossible to really take everything that's digitally available and put it in paper. This board may want some anchor documents in a folder, so if we could decide that under E. So Ms. Glenn, I'll ask you also to put that in your parking lot, and we'll mark it for that.
I think we have summary sheets goes in there too that we talked
And-
about before.
And Ms. Flemay has worked on an executive summary. It's not complete yet, but it's just so difficult to take everything and make it into a little mini without missing something. So she and I are gonna complete that this week and see if it's publishable for Saturday, okay? All right.
So are we gonna get into the Bureau Veritas costs for any of the buildings?
Can we talk, can I ask you to put that in the parking lot
Yeah.
for each? Okay, so we have 3 items in the parking lot. Pros and cons for where to start?
That's what you want to do, Jackie.
Just following the agenda. Okay.
Is the question of where to start something we're taking to the community and we're presenting to them the pros and cons of each of the 3 options?
You decide that. Would this board like to take
I mean, is
where to
that what
start to
4D
the?
is supposed to do?
I don't think we can really make that decision until we hear from the community on the 1 and 2 and 3 and 2.
So you think it's premature?
I do.
I agree.
I think timing, we haven't introduced the concept of time into the conversation thus far at all.
Well, I think that's
Beyond
where-
the idea of it's going to take a long time to do.
Well, I think that's the benefit of Mr. Stein. I know we keep coming back to this E. Sorry, not trying to take it out of the parking lot. But it is the pros and cons of it, of like,
I'm just making.
I don't think the community as a general understands the process of how long everything will take. And so having that, I don't know what the correct language we were using, that table set to, at the beginning, would be beneficial for understanding of how we're going to work with it. Like, a new high school takes 3 years to build. We're at 6 years out.
Doesn't change the concept of whether or not we're going to do it.
Correct.
Yes.
Exactly.
Right, they're 2 separate variables.
Right, right. And certain variables, as we've discussed, can be done concurrently for multiple different levels.
So I'm sorry, I lost track. Are you making a case for talking about timeline on Saturday or not talking about it?
Yes, talking about timeline from Mr. Stein. I think that he did a good.
That's a slightly different piece, though.
It is different.
The idea, having Mr. Stein talk about timelines so that everyone has a level set on expectations for how long this all generally takes. It's not going to be there in October. It's not going to be there when you show up in September, August, whatever that first day was. Lots of things can go parallel. I don't think we need to have the conversation with the community about, does it make sense to start at this level and run this level in parallel when we think the bonding might come at 36 months, like whatever. I don't think that is necessary, but I think him walking through a timeline of, here's generally how long it takes.
So the only pushback I would give to that is that it came up at the last conversation. And it came up in the focus group, or the room I sat in, where people were saying it needs to start at a certain level because of this. So, but whether you think that's necessary or not is fine if you
There's
want.
also a case for saying that maybe it's even premature for the board to be talking about it because we don't know what this is going to yield.
Right.
We can
Right, so
initiate
maybe-
that process at multiple levels at one time and just see what comes from it.
That would really put off determining your timeline for your long-range plan then.
He's showing me the clicker. Now you say something.
Where's she going?
Just so you know.
Where's she going, yeah.
Just put on a basketball game.
I think we need to have more concrete discussion.
Yeah, just I was thinking of doing that, just change it back to it.
I kind of,
We should have totally done that.
Oh my God, I was afraid, I was afraid.
One conversation.
Is it even a community decision?
I don't think it's a community decision about where to start.
Where to start? I think
Yeah.
that's more of a board decision.
It's a community discussion
After
about what to do. It is a board decision about when and how to do it.
But I don't think today is the day to have that conversation.
Oh, God, no.
We don't have enough information to do pros and cons.
No.
Well, you could do it conceptually and not.
That seems like a waste of
Well,
time.
that's fine. If
frankly.
that's not
Yeah.
what you feel like you want to get out of this community conversation, we
I
don't
think
need
we
to
take
do
it off
that
the
too.
agenda for the community, therefore we don't need to address it tonight.
But
So-
that overhead is very important that's on that screen.
All right, so now we go on to E, developing a
Parking lot.
community, the agenda, firming up the agenda.
Yes, does everyone agree that we are done with that task for now?
Yes.
That we believe it's part of our future, but right now we want to focus on the approaches or the concepts?
Yes.
future.
Yes.
Okay,
Did I say something different? Sorry.
but not
No.
the elementary concept.
The elementary we're set.
Okay, so let's build the agenda for Saturday. Usually, Mary, just again, like when you and I are planning for community conversation, we know like this frame.
Right.
And I don't know that we share that frame with the board last time. Can you just share the frame so that we can build an agenda for that?
Yeah, it really is beginning with the issue, and we started it, those who were at the conversation last time heard the overall framing of it, and then saying there are a couple of ways you can look at this. Some people might like this approach, and here are what some might say, and others might view it very differently. So you have the contrasting perspectives on the topic that just gives some talking points to either side, or a variety of them around that topic, and that helps people get into the conversation about each, like about 1 or 2 high schools, about 2 or 3 middle schools. I mean, that's why I'm capturing the pros and cons of the conversation, so that can frame, do we want 1 or 2, 2 or 3 middle schools? I think at the elementary level, as you suggested, Megan, it's announcing or assuming, I'm sorry, don't know who said it at this point, but, so we would frame it that way. It would be very helpful, I think, to have David Stein do some kind of an intro to begin with.
Is that agreeable with the board to have Dave make a few comments?
Can you do comments prior to laying out the issues and the approaches?
I was thinking that it
Because
was-
you want to go straight from that into the actual conversations,
Right.
into the actual small groups, as sort of here's what you're discussing, here's your
Do
assignment.
you want to do a recap or a highlight of the previous one like you were talking about, just the high points before we jump into the...
Maybe just say, this
Just
is
a
what we
very-
talk about
yeah,
in
yeah.
January without going through.
Without going through.
Yeah.
But we could possibly, going back to what we include in the folder, if there are any artifacts from that day, that I think we gave you guys some kind of summary or something,
We
right?
did, yes.
Yeah.
Key
And
points.
probably the summary of the summary, we could even use the
Summary of the
summary of the
summary.
summary of the
Yes,
summary.
please.
That information
Yes.
that was provided in our update with the.
It was this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the update with the Bureau
Okay.
Veritas table.
Yeah.
Oh, which I have here to pass out to everybody.
Those,
A
That's more
legible
legible.
copy.
I think some type of an artifact, and we had raised this briefly, and I remember it clearly because I sit next to him and he's loud. Mike had brought this up, and I think it's a good plan for the folders, is some type of, not an executive summary. I think that's really important too, but I think either as part of that or as a secondary piece to that is a data sheet. Not this, it's a bullet point list of the key facts that everyone keeps pointing back to and that no one recalls right off the top of their head and everyone has to shuffle through their papers to find, but we all ask for the
Like
same
what?
numbers over and over. Square footage of each of the middle schools, square footage each of the high schools,
We have it.
cost per student, numbers per, square footage per student per Connecticut standards,
Oh,
$1,000 per square foot. Reimbursement rate is
This table on there
170,
gives all
like
the
there-
square footage.
there are different, but it's not just that variable, it's like, there are different data points and different variables that we are constantly asking and that we were asked for repeatedly during the last community conversation, that I remember saying, we have that's somewhere, that's in a thing I can't put my hands on, that's on the website, that's on page 32 of something that we saw in December, but it's those kinds of things that everybody, the really basic information, since we're talking high school and middle school, what are the basic facts around that?
we
so that
have it, but
everyone's
we just
working?
don't have it on one sheet. And
That's what I'm saying, we
I
have
don't
all
know
of
that I
this
can
data.
produce that by Saturday though, because now we're digging through it and creating a chart, so, and I don't know all the titles that you're saying, but
Mhm.
we could try to find some summaries of some things, but I don't know that'll be comprehensive.
It's a better start than not having anything, and if it's some type of reference point, fact sheet type of thing, that feels helpful.
Okay, I had, when we had the SLAM and the Vera Veritas quantitative numbers, I did start a matrix by all 14 buildings. And just to kind of capture, again, the quantitative, obviously, we did the surveys and the focus groups, which is the qualitative. But it does capture, I mean, I can send it over to you both, just where we were on those two pieces, A, B, now
On
we're in C.
enrollment and.
Yep, it had enrollment, it actually had
Enrollment
filled in these
projections.
numbers and over the years, how many, because I'm a matrix thinker, that's a very methodical way to look at things. And again, in this many years, it's gonna need this much dollars over the 10-year period. So I can send that to you, but it did have the factual numbers that we were given. So I can, that's a sort of a boilerplate if you wanna look at that, but I did populate that once upon a time, before we got into the qualitative stuff, so.
Just also say that you as scribes for the conversation shouldn't be the ones pulling out the facts. Okay, you're there really to listen, and your moderator probably doesn't want to be pulling out the facts either, but they can be in the folders for information if people need them. You could say check your folders, but you don't want to throw off the sort of power dynamic by having the facts.
So I think we do start with a little bit of a summary of January. Again, it could be the same people, it could be different people, but just to bring them up to speed on, this is a process and we're engaging the community, reassure them we're engaging the community. And then I think by bringing in Mr. Stein, he also sets the stage for this isn't happening tomorrow, right? He can kind of say, this is a process and this is what the normal process is, just so we can put up people's minds at ease, because this could be a meeting or a gathering where there could start to get some emotion involved. Maybe, I don't know. But, you're starting to get a little more granular on some of the actualities of things happening. But by Mr. Stein going, sort of letting the groundwork that this is a process and this is what it normally looks like, it might be a little bit like, oh, okay, so this isn't happening tomorrow. I think it might help, start to set the stage. So.
We expected more emotion last time, so.
We did. We had great conversation, but we're getting a little more,
We expect it for real this time.
serious.
Do we allow the community to ask him questions? I think it would be beneficial. And put a time limit on it.
But it could get out of
Control.
I feel like he could manage it with one of you.
I'm sorry?
He seems capable of managing that within the context.
Let's put a time limit on it.
We could have to frame it with parameters. Like, what are we looking for those questions to be based on,
Or just give him a minder who's holding the
Not
microphone.
and you can say that he won't answer questions about specific schools. Maybe that's the parameter?
Questions
I
about
think he can
processes.
navigate that.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
And do you guys want him to do this entire presentation?
No. This presentation to me presumed 2 middle schools. Very much so, yeah. I would not do this exact presentation.
Okay. But what is it that you want him to share then?
This slide for sure. I think this is the most important thing he mentioned tonight.
I think if he does the middle school portion take a singular school and demonstrate how a site plan of looking at the size of the school and where, and how we would need to plan. I think that's.
Do you want him to do the one high school information?
Yeah. The 1 versus 2.
But if you want to have a dialogue about 2 middle schools, then I think gray slide chart and the next one, there are no numbers. The one that says high school, the amount of space per student varies. Can I have the clicker?
No. Fancy.
This slide, to give people some numerical understanding of one high school. And then
That one.
this one, so people understand the 2 versus 3, right? And we could skip that.
Wait, what about the one earlier about Connecticut school construction standards and guidelines?
So I would say let him establish his credibility 1 and 2, right? I've been here, been doing this 33 years. The construction standard guidelines is a yes. The things to consider when consolidating a high school would be a yes. Things to consider for middle and elementaries would be a yes. This would be a yes. This would be a yes. This sounds too much like pointing to two schools,
I
so
agree.
no, right? I think if we're not talking about elementary, do you need this slide?
No.
No.
It's a great slide, but I don't think we need it for Saturday. I'm also not sure if it landed in there. I think the 2013-14 facility utilization slide, we went by that one really fast. I don't think you should show that. The one with all the colored dots and the shading for all the
What's the
different.
next one? This one?
No, I'm sorry.
I think he's just trying to say that I've done this work with you guys before.
Right, there was a lot of DSD in that room from previous decisions and plans and schools moving around. I just wouldn't touch it. There's credibility, just my 2 cents. You can. We're gonna be like, oh, you really wanted to do that?
Well, nothing really came of the last facility study.
Maybe he could just establish his credibility in a different way. Okay. I will leave it up to him, okay? I do think he's well respected and regarded. I don't think there's any PTSD with him in specific. How about this one?
No. Because this is elementary school.
No.
And this would be very hard for anybody to see.
Yeah. Okay. How about this one? Examples of projects in the state?
I think so.
I think it's misleading though, because
Because of the cost?
the total project cost of 132 million is so
That's
far
why you have to
off.
highlight the left hand.
It came out to 145 if you take a look at it online.
That's still less than
Right, but it's still
$1,000 square
less,
foot.
I mean, it
was all pre
would be
everything.
$270
But that was,
million.
because that was
So it's-
completed in
it's
2024,
way-
the kickoff ones in 2025.
That's
were
my
realistic.
concern.
Yeah.
When you
We
look
started-
at that,
started in
it tells a
2021.
whole different
So
story.
you
No.
leave out the Farmington part and just show the other two? So
Yeah,
those are
show the
some
other
of
two
the ones that are
because
the
they-
projects.
I think it's beneficial to show how costs have changed
Yeah.
over the last few years. And if he
As long as
emphasizes
it
that
highlights that
point,
this one was
But-
completed in 2024.
But having that
and
slide
started-
out there without any explanation is dangerous,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think. Because somebody who doesn't hear him say about, doesn't hear what he says about the slide and just looks at that slide, oh, it only cost 132 million.
Unless he edits it to say.
But I think the more
pre-
current ones,
Pandemic.
just to give some kind of like
The
standard.
left-hand side? I
Yeah.
think, yeah, that's fine.
Because we're
I
using the
object to the
$1,000
right-hand
on
side.
all
Take out Farmington, leave the other two. It's also the purpose of what we want him to talk about is the details related to the process, and this is not related to either of them. So dropping the whole thing entirely does not take away from what we want his
Although I don't know
objective
that
to be.
people will be able to see.
It probably, and one thing that people have very clearly said is we need some idea of how much it's gonna cost
Correct.
to
Yeah.
build
Yeah.
one
Yeah.
high school
Yeah,
versus two high
Yeah.
schools.
And we're using the $1,000 metric on this sheet. In this case, it's $1,000. Here's two projects.
Okay.
So I think
And then the next two slides.
Yep.
Yeah.
What is that?
I agree. This is all the ones that we see. The cost per square foot. But this school, how much real estate
Well,
is.
that's standard, because it shows.
This is from this.
Okay.
So that's 2 agenda items, 1 and 2.
That was like
And
lower
then-
agenda items, depending on how you
So
count.
you
we're
have to
now
frame.
talking, those two are in the large group.
Okay,
And
yep.
then we break into,
1 and 2 is one high school or two?
No, I'm sorry. Agenda items, talk about the
Recap.
January 20 recap and where, where the conversations went and the summary. We as a board saw it, it was televised, but just to bring anybody up to speed.
David Stein.
And number 2 is
David Stein.
Mr. Stein, yes, and now we're on next.
Then it would be framing,
The approach, the contrasting
Framing.
perspective, 1 to 2, 2 versus 3.
framing with the small.
I actually think it might be better if he started and then you did the recap and then it flows better
Okay.
because he's giving the overarching process and then we talk about what we discussed last time and now we're here to talk about and
Okay.
in your small
Yep.
groups.
Okay.
But he can't be the first person that talks. It has to be
No,
somebody
Susan
actually
Shaker.
Yeah,
framing
no,
the thing. Yeah.
The usuals.
Yeah.
She's gonna welcome everybody. All right. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Sue kickoff, Mr. Stein, January recap, why are we here today? By 10 o'clock, everyone is breaking out into their groups, and we spend 90 minutes. We only have 5 facilitators right now, so we are trying to recruit 5 more, because we have 50 people signed up. I believe after Ms. Flemay sends out an update tomorrow with a specific agenda, we might get more people to sign up.
Do we need to spend 90 minutes in the small groups?
I felt like we needed it last time.
Oh, we definitely
Is that how long we were in there last time?
Well, we had more questions last time.
But it's also a
This is
community
deeper.
conversation, and this is their chance to talk.
Yeah.
Right, I see it as more as like, we could come together and talk more as a bigger community, which I know.
100 people?
They'd rather talk in small groups. They're not comfortable talking in big groups.
Yeah.
The small groups is what's drawing people to it.
Yes.
I think that we got a lot of feedback on how nice the small group was, and they felt heard.
Yep.
I think if you go to 100 groups talking, that you're gonna have some people dominate the dialogue, and possibly not always for the right reason.
Right. I can tell you the 6 people you're gonna hear from in that room.
Right.
So they're not in this room. Okay, so, and you guys will be scribes again?
Yes.
Did that work for everybody?
Yep.
And you don't have to come early for training, because you know what you're doing.
And we have 8 definite.
We'll get you, don't worry.
Yeah, I'll show up early.
8 board members definite, maybe 9. So there's 1 board member that definitely will not be here.
So we need a scribe.
If you're gonna have 10 groups.
Yeah.
Or 2. A scribe or 2.
Yes, ma'am, thank you. Okay. Ms. Doyle, did we answer your question when we asked you to park and lock it? Parking
Yes.
lock it, lot it?
Yes.
Okay. Ms. Glennon, we
I
asked
don't
you to
remember
parking
what my
lot?
question was.
Ms. Preet, did we answer your question?
I don't know. Are we gonna
Something
bring in
about BV.
all of the Bureau Veritas numbers to,
Artifacts.
on
I think
any
the
of
one
schools?
sheeter,
The fact
Okay.
sheet, the one-page fact sheet
Okay, and where will that
the one
be
that you got
introduced?
in the folders.
In the folders? Okay. Are we gonna have discussion about it, or are we gonna let them peruse it?
We're just gonna give them
Let them-
information.
Okay,
Tell them
got
it's-
it.
Tell them it's there.
Okay, tell them it's there, yes, please. Okay.
Projections,
Mhm.
square footage,
What is the
basics.
cost? Okay.
My question was just commenting that, people did say they'd like to see some numbers. And I think, the programming piece, I think it's important, especially for the middle school piece. And I don't know how to,
It's in the executive summary, I think. Some of the single slides from the June presentation that we did to the board
Okay.
were included in the executive summary, so at least something like that on programming is there. But I'll have Mr. Altieri review that and make sure that it represents our current thinking. Can we do a swing around the room and see if there's any final thinking on the agenda from Saturday?
When we come back after our 90 minutes, we do the regroup again, and everybody
ma'am.
brings up their
Same thing.
Same thing.
Okay. In classes, we usually say, all right, we're going to give you guys a minute to reflect, and we're going to whip around the room for a final word. It's called the final word protocol. Okay? So everyone gets just a little reflection. We won't start with the new guy.
Thanks.
But we will end with you, Adam.
Sure.
Mr. Scrivby, sorry.
I'm assuming that means I start.
Well, we could do sometimes teachers just start right in the middle.
It's 9:51 to start.
I am happy that we are moving forward and we can make some decisions, that we are progressing.
And are you satisfied with the Saturday agenda?
Yes.
Okay. Ms.
I am
Scrivby?
satisfied with the Saturday agenda, for the most part. I'm a little conflicted about this part right here, but in general, I think it's good.
Are there any revisions you would make to the agenda?
No.
Okay. Any final words, or?
I wish I was gonna be there on Saturday.
Oh.
I'm the one that's not gonna be there.
And we will only be videoing the intro and the end again, so you'll have access to those, okay? Ms. Muller?
I'm good. I think the agenda reflects the decision points that are the most significant ones in front of us right now, which are still high school and middle school, but I think we've come to such a tight decision point on both of those now that we're right at the finish line on both.
I think the agenda covers what we need to know right now.
I'm good. I like how we're doing this.
I'm good too. I think we're on the right track. I think this is the normal progression and we're moving along. It's fine.
I agree. How was that for nice and sweet?
I'm good with the agenda, and I think we had some good conversations today that got us, and we did eventually get back on track on the agenda. So,
All right, no pressure here.
I'm
Closing
good
it
with the
out.
agenda.
Not that you would disagree at this point.
Do not start all over us.
Can we go back?
Dr. Broderick and Dr. Reynolds, we'll let you guys close out.
I'm good. I think the group will be making decisions.
Ditto. Thank you. Okay, thank you.
Yes,
Well, Roman
motion
numeral
number 5.
Public comment.
Yep.
There's nobody here, so we can.
Ms. Fleming?
I'm good.
She's like,
Motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Oh, Mike.
Oh, Mike. We forgot to ask Mike. I'm so sorry.
Oh, Mike, are you there?
It's okay, I didn't want to extend the meeting, I'm good.
Are you okay with the agenda?
Yes, I am.
All right, great. Start.
It's hard to remember that there's somebody there when it's just a little head.
And they're behind you. Yeah.
Okay, so we're adjourned at 9:55.
Hey, good work, board. Yeah, good work.